Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most claustrophobic, underappreciated, and genuinely miserable jobs in medieval Europe, the bridge toll collector. Picture this. You're wedged inside a wooden box barely wider than your outstretched arms, perched precariously over a river that's equal parts transportation highway and communal toilet. Your entire day consists of arguing with merchants who think your prices are highway robbery, dodging the occasional thrown vegetable from peasants who can't afford the crossing fee, and trying to keep track of a pricing system so complicated it makes modern tax codes look like children's picture books. The stone bridge stretches behind you, a marvel of medieval engineering that took decades to build and cost more than a small kingdom's annual revenue. And you're the human coin slot, the living barrier between travelers and their destinations, universally despised and barely compensated for your troubles. You probably won't survive the first winter, or the first flood, or the first angry mob, or honestly, the first week of trying to calculate the difference between the toll for 12 geese, live versus 12 geese, recently deceased and probably stolen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see this little community stretched across time zones, all winding down together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey to this particular circle of medieval hell begins on a gray morning in, let's say, 1340. You've just been appointed to the toll house on the bridge spanning the River Thames at London, though appointed is a generous term for what actually happened. More accurately, you owed money to the wrong person, or you were the youngest son with no inheritance prospects, or perhaps you witnessed something you shouldn't have and this job is your reward for keeping quiet. The position came with promises: steady work, a roof over your head, the prestige of serving the crown's interests. What it didn't mention was that the roof leaks. The steady work means 18-hour days, and the only prestige you'll experience is being prestigiously hated by everyone who crosses this bridge. The toll house itself is an architectural afterthought, a wooden structure bolted onto the side of the stone bridge like a barnacle on a ship's hull. It was added 30 years after the bridge's completion because someone in the king's treasury realized that all these people crossing for free represented untapped revenue. The bridge, meanwhile, is genuinely impressive. 19 stone arches spanning over 900 feet, with a drawbridge section in the middle to let tall-masted ships pass through. Construction took 33 years and the lives of at least 50 workers, though the exact number is lost to history because medieval workplace safety records weren't exactly comprehensive. Peter de Colchurch, the bridge's designer, is buried in the chapel built right into the structure. Yes, there's a chapel on the bridge, because of course there is. Medieval people put chapels everywhere. It's like how we put Starbucks on every corner, except with more prayers and fewer pumpkin spice lattes. Your toll house measures approximately 8 feet by 10 feet. For context, that's smaller than a modern prison cell, and at least prisoners don't have to listen to merchants complaining about prices all day. The entrance faces the roadway, a simple wooden door with iron reinforcement because the previous toll collector learned the hard way that angry travelers sometimes express their dissatisfaction physically. There's a small window with wooden shutters. Glass is for rich people and churches, and a slot just large enough to pass coins through. The slot is positioned at chest height because making people bend down to pay was considered unnecessarily demeaning, which is hilarious given that the entire job is demeaning by nature. Inside, you've got a wooden bench that doubles as your bed, a small table for counting money, and a locked chest bolted to the floor where you store the day's collections. The chest has 3 locks, and 3 different officials hold the keys because apparently everyone assumes you're a thief just waiting for the opportunity. The walls are single-layer oak planks, which means you hear everything happening outside with crystal clarity. Every conversation, every argument, every cart while squeaking past becomes the soundtrack to your existence. In winter, gaps between the planks let in wind that cuts through your clothing like icy knives. You stuff rags and moss into the cracks, but it's a temporary solution at best. The wood swells in summer humidity and shrinks in winter cold, creating an ever-changing puzzle of drafts and gaps. Previous toll collectors have carved their names into the walls, a tradition or maybe just desperate boredom. You trace your fingers over William, 1327, and wonder if William quit, died, or went mad. Probably the latter if you're being honest. Below your feet, through the floorboards, you hear the constant rush of the Thames. The river is the city's lifeblood, its highway, its sewer, and its occasional mass grave all rolled into one murky package. During your first night in the toll house, that sound keeps you awake. The endless susurration of water against stone pilings. By the second week, you don't even notice it anymore, which is either adaptation or the first sign that your mind is protecting itself through selective hearing loss. The bridge's pilings narrow the river's flow, which makes the water rush through faster and louder. Engineers call this the Venturi effect, though medieval bridge builders just called it the reason we lost 3 workers during construction. The rushing water also creates vibrations that travel up through the stone into your wooden box, a constant, almost imperceptible trembling that you feel in your bones during quiet moments. Your working hours are technically dawn to dusk, but in practice, that means whenever there's enough light to see coins and whenever there are still people trying to cross. In summer, you're working 16-hour days. In winter, you're still working 12-hour days, just colder ones. There's no concept of weekends. The bridge operates 7 days a week because sin and commerce don't take Sundays off, despite what the church might prefer. You get feast days off, theoretically, but someone still needs to collect tolls even on Christmas. And that someone is often you because the substitute collector conveniently developed a mysterious illness that only affects him on holidays. The job came with training, which consisted of the previous toll collector, a gray-faced man named Thomas who looked 70 but was probably 40, spending 3 hours explaining the toll schedule. You quickly realized why he looked so haggard. The toll structure is Byzantine in its complexity, a masterpiece of medieval bureaucratic thinking that makes absolutely no practical sense. A knight on horseback pays 1 penny. A merchant with a cart of wool pays 4 pennies. A merchant with a cart of dyed wool pays 6 pennies because processed goods are taxed higher. A merchant with a cart of wool dyed red pays 8 pennies because luxury colors incur additional fees. A herd of sheep crossing costs 1 penny per 10 animals, but if those sheep are pregnant, there's a supplementary charge because they're technically transporting additional animals that don't exist yet. You ask Thomas if anyone actually pays the pregnant sheep tax, and he just laughed, a dry, humorless sound like wind through dead leaves, and said, "You'll learn." Historians still argue whether bridge tolls were primarily revenue generation or traffic management tools, and the answer is probably yes. Medieval cities were chronically short on funds, and a major bridge represented both massive construction debt and steady income potential. But tolls also discouraged unnecessary traffic, which was important because too many people and animals on a bridge simultaneously could lead to dangerous crowding or even structural damage. The tolls walked a fine line, high enough to matter, low enough that people wouldn't swim across or use illegal ferries operated by entrepreneurs who preferred to work outside the royal taxation system. Your predecessor Thomas had one final piece of advice before he departed, delivered with the kind of exhausted sincerity that only comes from years of suffering. Never trust anyone, count every coin twice, and sleep with the chest between you and the door. Then he shuffled off into the London streets, a free man for the first time in 12 years, and you never saw him again. You heard later that he died 3 months into his retirement, which seems unfair but also somehow predictable. Some people survive through sheer momentum, and removing that momentum just lets them collapse. The first traveler you encounter sets the tone for everything that follows. He's a wool merchant with 2 carts, and the argument begins immediately. He insists he should pay the 4-penny rate. You explain that he has 2 carts, which means 8 pennies. He counters that they're both his carts, so it should count as one commercial enterprise. You point out that each cart takes up space on the bridge and must be charged separately. He suggests that you're new at this and don't understand how things really work. This is code for the previous toll collector accepted bribes. You hold firm because the bridge warden, your supervisor, is watching from the gatehouse at the far end, and your first day is not the time to establish yourself as corrupt. The merchant pays, but not before calling you several creative names that question your parentage, intelligence, and personal hygiene. Welcome to your new life. You're a human calculator, referee, punching bag, and scapegoat all rolled into one underpaid package. The bridge stretches ahead of you and behind you, a river of stone across a river of water, and you're the troll under the bridge except you're on top of it and everyone hates you anyway. You've got years of this ahead, years of coins, complaints, cold, and the constant background roar of the Thames reminding you that it's right there, waiting, if you ever decide you've had enough. But you probably won't jump. The river's too filthy, and knowing your luck, you'd survive the fall and just end up with dysentery. Your toll house isn't just small. It's aggressively, claustrophobically, almost maliciously small in ways that seem intentional. Whoever designed this structure clearly never planned to spend a single night inside it, let alone years. The interior dimensions give you just enough room to stand, turn around, and sit down, which is apparently all a medieval toll collector needs according to the bureaucrats who approved the construction. There's no space for pacing when you're anxious, no room to stretch when your back aches from sitting, nowhere to escape the walls that seem to press inward during the long, dark hours after the last traveler has crossed and you're alone with your thoughts and the sound of the river. The construction method is what builders call post and beam, which sounds more impressive than it actually is. Vertical oak posts form the corners and frame, with horizontal beams connecting them. The walls are simply planks nailed to this frame. No insulation, no plaster, no consideration for comfort whatsoever. Oak is excellent for durability, which is why it was chosen, but it's also heavy and expensive. The fact that they used oak at all tells you the structure was meant to last, which is either reassuring or depressing depending on how you feel about spending years in a wooden box. The whole assembly is anchored to the stone bridge with iron brackets and bolts, 8 of them in total, driven directly into the masonry. You can see them from inside, massive iron spikes that penetrate through your floor and disappear into stone below. At night, when carts rumble past, these bolts transmit vibrations directly into the wood, making the entire structure hum like a tuning fork. The roof is your primary nemesis. It's steeply pitched, necessary for shedding rain in England's perpetually damp climate, and covered with wooden shingles that were probably waterproof when they were new. That was 15 years ago. Now they're a patchwork of original shingles, replacement shingles, and gaps where shingles used to be before wind claimed them. When it rains, and it rains constantly because this is London, water finds every possible entry point. You've got a collection of wooden bowls and clay pots positioned strategically beneath known leaks, and you've become adept at identifying which drip sound corresponds to which container. The hollow plink of water hitting an empty bowl. The duller plunk when it's half full. The overflow splash when you've forgotten to empty one and it's cascading onto the floor. It's like living inside a discordant musical instrument that only plays during storms. The window facing the roadway is your workspace and your prison viewport simultaneously. It measures about 2 feet wide by 18 inches tall. Large enough to conduct business, small enough to defend if things get violent. The wooden shutters are your only control over privacy and temperature, which means you're constantly making impossible choices. Close them and you're warmer but can't see approaching travelers, which means you'll miss collecting tolls and get disciplined by the bridge warden. Open them and you're freezing but doing your job. In practice, you keep them open except during the absolute worst weather, which means you're cold roughly 70% of the time. The shutter mechanism itself is simple. Two wooden panels that swing inward on leather hinges, secured with a wooden bar that drops into iron brackets. Leather hinges are cheaper than metal ones, but they stretch and rot over time, giving the shutters an increasingly loose, sloppy movement. The previous toll collector reinforced them with scraps of rawhide, and you'll do the same because there's no maintenance budget for things as trivial as hinges that actually work properly. Everything about this structure is maintained through improvisation and desperation rather than planning and resources. Your floor is uneven oak planking that's warped from years of moisture and temperature changes. The boards run perpendicular to the bridge's length, which makes sense structurally but means every gap between them aligns with the river below. In summer, you occasionally see shafts of sunlight penetrating through these gaps, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. In winter, cold air rises through these same gaps like icy breath, making the floor painful to walk on with bare feet. You learn quickly to keep your boots on at all times, even when sleeping, because the cold is relentless and frostbite doesn't care about your comfort preferences. The structural design creates interesting acoustic properties that nobody warned you about. Your toll house acts as a resonance chamber for sounds from the bridge, amplifying footsteps, cartwheels, and conversations. A whispered conversation 50 feet away reaches you as clearly as if the speakers were standing beside you, which sounds useful until you realize this means you hear every insult, complaint, and unflattering observation about toll collectors that travelers exchange while waiting in line. Highway robbery, they mutter. Blood-sucking leech. I'd rather swim. You develop a thick skin quickly or you go insane. Those are your only options. The cantilevered design, your toll house jutting out from the bridge's side rather than sitting on top, creates a perpetual sense of imbalance. Intellectually, you know the structure is sound. The supporting beams are massive and the brackets are secure. But emotionally, psychologically, your hindbrain never quite accepts that you're not about to plunge into the Thames at any moment. When heavy carts pass, the bridge deflects slightly, we're talking millimeters, barely perceptible, but your cantilevered box amplifies this movement. You feel the structure dip and sway, just enough to remind you that you're suspended over rushing water by human engineering that's only as good as its weakest component. You've inspected those supporting beams 100 times, looking for cracks, rot, anything that might indicate impending failure. So far, they're solid. So far. Historians still argue whether these cantilevered toll houses were originally part of the bridge design or later additions, and the architectural evidence suggests mostly the latter. Many major bridges were built as purely functional structures, and the revenue-generating additions came years or decades afterward when authorities realized they were sitting on untapped income sources. This explains why toll houses often look architecturally inconsistent with their bridges. They're literally afterthoughts, bolted on wherever space permitted. Your particular toll house sits about 2/3 of the way across the bridge, positioned where the northern road widens slightly. This location was chosen because it's past the point where travelers might easily turn back, but before the final approach to the city gates where traffic congestion becomes impossible to manage. The door is your only physical security, and it's built accordingly. Solid oak planking, 2 inches thick, reinforced with iron bands riveted directly through the wood. The hinges are proper iron this time. This is where they spent money. And the door swings on a wooden dowel that fits into stone sockets top and bottom. There's a substantial crossbar on the inside, a beam of oak that drops into iron brackets, effectively barricading you inside. At night, you're instructed to bar the door, which technically makes you safer but also traps you inside a wooden box with no escape route if something goes wrong. Fire is the recurring nightmare. If the bridge catches fire, and wooden structures catch fire with alarming regularity in medieval London, your barred door becomes your coffin. You'll have perhaps 30 seconds to unbar it, grab the money chest, and escape before smoke or flames overwhelm you. You've practiced this evacuation in your mind 100 times, but you've never actually drilled it because opening the chest requires 3 keys that you don't possess. The money chest itself is a masterwork of paranoid design. Iron-bound oak, roughly 2 feet long by 18 inches wide and deep. 3 separate locks, 3 different officials holding keys, the bridge warden, the city treasurer, and a representative from the crown. The theory is that no single person can access the funds without the other's cooperation, preventing theft through redundancy. The reality is that you're sitting on thousands of pennies that you can't access even in an emergency, which creates its own special kind of psychological torture. You're simultaneously wealthy and destitute, a custodian of money you'll never touch beyond counting it and dropping it through the chest slot. The chest is bolted to the floor with the same kind of massive iron spikes that anchor the entire structure, which means it's permanent and immovable and you're constantly tripping over it in the cramped space. Your furniture situation is minimalist by necessity and medieval standards. The bench doubles as your bed because there's no room for both. The 7 feet long, adequate for sleeping if you're under 6 feet tall, uncomfortable if you're taller. The wood is smooth from years of bodies pressing against it, polished by countless toll collectors' restless sleep. There's no mattress, no padding, just bare oak and whatever blankets you can provide for yourself. You've made a cushion of sorts from old wool sacks stuffed with straw, which helps slightly but also hosts an impressive ecosystem of fleas, lice, and other small creatures that enjoy feasting on sleeping humans. You could get a proper mattress, theoretically, but it would cost weeks of salary and wouldn't fit through the door anyway. Medieval furniture is built on-site or designed to disassemble, and your toll house was never designed with creature comforts in mind. The table is a simple affair, 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, made from pine because oak was too expensive for furniture. Its surface is scarred and stained from years of coin counting, marked with scratches, burns from candles, and dark rings where wet containers sat too long. This table is your workspace, dining area, and occasional pillow when you're too exhausted to make it to the bench. You eat here, count here, sleep here sometimes with your face pressed against wood that smells like old metal and mildew. The table has a single drawer stuck half open permanently from humidity damage where you keep your counting tools, a small brass scale for weighing coins, a piece of chalk for making tallies on a slate, and a knife for defending yourself if things turn violent, though you hope it never comes to that. Lighting is a constant challenge and expense. You're expected to maintain operation from dawn to dusk, but those boundaries are fuzzy, especially in winter when dawn comes late and dusk comes early. You need light to see coins properly, to distinguish silver from tin, to spot clipped or counterfeit pieces, to read the denominations. Candles are expensive, and you purchase them from your own salary, which creates a perverse incentive to work in darkness and risk mistakes. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, are cheapest but smoke terribly and smell like rendering plants. Beeswax candles burn cleaner and smell better but cost 3 times as much. You compromise with tallow during busy periods and save the beeswax for detailed counting at day's end. The smell becomes part of your permanent atmosphere, a greasy, acrid presence that clings to your clothes and hair. You'll smell like burning fat for years, and long after you leave this job, if you leave this job, people will occasionally wrinkle their noses around you and you'll know exactly why. The ventilation situation ranges from inadequate to what ventilation. Your only air sources are the window, the door, and the gaps in the walls and floor. In summer, this creates a through draft that's actually pleasant, carrying away the accumulated heat and smell. In winter, this same draft becomes a howling menace that no amount of stuffed rags can fully block. You learn to orient your body to minimize exposure, sitting at angles that reduce direct wind contact, wrapping yourself in layers that trap air without restricting movement. Medieval people understood insulation principles even if they didn't have the vocabulary for them. Multiple loose layers trap air, creating dead space that retains heat. You wear a linen undertunic, a wool tunic over that, sometimes a third layer on especially cold days, and your outer cloak always within reach. One quirky architectural feature that nobody mentioned during your training. Your toll house has a small carved wooden face above the door lintel on the exterior. It's about 6 inches tall, weathered and primitive, depicting a scowling bearded man. Previous toll collectors have added to it over the years. Someone painted the eyes blue once, though the paint has mostly flaked away. Someone else carved additional wrinkles around the mouth, deepening the scowl. It's become a tradition of sorts, each toll collector adding some small modification, a way of saying, "I was here and I hated it." You haven't added your mark yet. You're not sure what you'd change. Maybe you'll give it tears. The whole structure weighs approximately 800 pounds when empty, mostly the oak frame and floor planking. Add your body weight, the iron chest, your possessions, and accumulated water during storms, and you're looking at close to 1,000 pounds suspended from the bridge's side by brackets and hope. Engineers would tell you this is well within safety margins, that the stone bridge could support 10 times this load. But engineers aren't the ones sleeping here during storms, feeling the structure sway and creak, listening to it grain shift and iron brackets groan under stress. You become intimately familiar with every sound your toll house makes, learning to distinguish normal settling from potentially dangerous changes. That's a skill they don't teach you, but you acquire fast. Survival has a way of accelerating education. Your view through that window becomes your entire world. You watch London pass by in segments. Merchants, pilgrims, livestock, soldiers, nobility in covered wagons, criminals being transported to trial or execution. The bridge is a compressed version of society. Every class and profession funneled through the stone corridor, and you're the gatekeeper who makes them all pay. It's monotonous and fascinating simultaneously, repetitive yet unpredictable. You see the same people regularly. The baker who crosses every morning, the fishmonger hauling his catch to market, the priest who always looks disapproving, as if your very existence offends his theological sensibilities. You also see novelties, a dancing bear once, an elephant being transported to the Tower Menagerie, a wedding procession so elaborate it backed up traffic for an hour. And through it all, below you, the Thames flows endlessly. Brown in summer, gray-brown in winter, occasionally black under storm clouds. You see boats passing underneath, threading between the bridge's pilings with practiced ease. Pilots who've made this passage 1,000 times and know exactly which channels offer safe passage. You see debris floating downstream, broken barrels, timber from construction sites, occasionally things you'd rather not identify. Once you saw a body face down, arms floating wide, moving with horrible grace down the river toward the sea. You reported it to the bridge warden, who noted it with the enthusiasm of someone recording routine information, and that was that. Death is common enough that it doesn't warrant special attention unless it's noble death, which this clearly wasn't. Welcome to your architectural prison, your wooden womb, your home for the foreseeable future. 8 by 10 feet of creaking oak suspended over England's most important river. It's smaller than you imagined, colder than you expected, and infinitely more depressing than they described during recruitment. But it's yours now, for better or worse, and you'll learn every inch of it with the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from having absolutely no alternative. The wind picks up, and your toll house groans. Just normal settling. Probably. You hope. The toll schedule is a document that appears to have been designed by a committee of sadists who wanted to create the most confusing pricing structure humanly possible. It's written on vellum, actual prepared animal skin because paper is still expensive and rare, in Latin for the official version and barely legible Middle English for the working copy you're expected to use. The handwriting looks like a drunk spider fell into an inkwell and staggered across the page. Your predecessor Thomas walked you through it once, speaking rapidly in the tone of someone who knows he's about to be free and doesn't want to waste a single additional minute in this job. You took notes on a wax tablet, scratching desperately as he rattled off exceptions, special cases, and the various ways travelers will try to cheat you. The basic structure seems simple at first. Pedestrians pay a halfpenny, riders pay a penny, carts pay based on cargo. But then the exceptions begin. Pilgrims traveling to Canterbury pay half rate. You're supposed to verify this by checking for pilgrimage tokens, which can be purchased cheaply or forged easily, making enforcement essentially impossible. Merchants with royal charters pay reduced rates, which means you need to examine documents that might be authentic or might be clever forgeries. Clergy pay nothing, supposedly, but you're expected to collect voluntary donations that are exactly equal to the standard toll, which is just taxation with extra theological steps. Knights in service to the crown don't pay, but knights in service to lesser nobles do, and you're somehow expected to know the difference by looking at heraldry you've never studied on tabards covered in road dust. The cargo classifications are where things become truly Byzantine. Raw wool is 4 pennies per cart. Woven wool is 6 pennies. Dyed wool is 8 pennies. Wool products, blankets, clothing, tapestries are 10 pennies because they're finished goods. But here's where it gets interesting. If a merchant is transporting raw wool and woven wool in the same cart, do you charge the higher rate for everything or calculate proportionally? The official answer is proportional, but estimating proportions by eye while a line of impatient travelers grows behind the cart is essentially impossible. So you make your best guess, the merchant argues because they always argue, you settle on a number that's probably wrong, and everyone moves on mildly dissatisfied. This is the job in a nutshell, producing dissatisfaction with maximum effort. Livestock presents its own special challenges. The rate is 1 penny per 10 animals, which sounds straightforward until you're trying to count sheep that won't stand still, or pigs that keep wandering, or chickens in cages stacked so densely you can't see how many there actually are. Geese are charged as poultry unless they're breeding geese, which are agricultural stock and taxed at a different rate. How do you tell a breeding goose from a regular goose? You ask the farmer, who lies. You charge them for regular geese. They complain. You shrug. The system is fundamentally broken, but it's not your job to fix it, only to implement it with whatever grace you can muster, which after the first week is approximately none. Horses are charged individually. 1 penny per horse, 2 pennies per warhorse, 3 pennies per breeding stallion. Distinguishing between a regular horse and a warhorse requires understanding horse breeds, training, and equipment, none of which you possessed before taking this job. You learn quickly through trial and error. Warhorses are bigger, heavier, usually wearing more substantial tack. Breeding stallions are identified by their handlers' indignant insistence that yes, this is obviously a valuable breeding animal worth the higher toll. You suspect fraud regularly, but challenging a noble's word about his expensive horse is an excellent way to end up jobless or worse. So you nod, collect the higher toll, and move on. Then there are the specialty categories that appear nowhere in the official schedule but exist through precedent and custom, which is somehow legally binding despite being entirely verbal and contradictory. Musicians pay half rate because they're entertaining people, supposedly, though the logic here is questionable. Actors pay full rate because theater is sinful, according to someone who made this decision decades ago. Merchants selling religious items, icons, relics, indulgence papers, pay nothing because challenging them might be blasphemous, and you're not risking your immortal soul over a few pennies. Merchants selling books pay double because literacy is luxury and luxury can be taxed aggressively. You have no idea if books are actually in the official schedule or if this is another customs invention, but everyone accepts it so you enforce it. Periodic goods receive seasonal pricing adjustments that you're expected to memorize. Fresh fish costs more to transport in summer, higher toll, because it spoils quickly and represents rushed shipping. Salt is cheaper in winter when preservation is critical, so it gets reduced rates during cold months. Grain prices vary by harvest quality each year, and somehow this affects toll rates through a mechanism nobody has adequately explained to you. You're just handed an updated schedule twice yearly and told to implement it. The schedule is written on a small piece of vellum that you're expected to keep clean, dry, and legible despite working in a damp wooden box where everything eventually mildews. You've copied it 3 times already this year after previous versions became unreadable. The military exemptions are politically fraught and constantly changing. Soldiers traveling on crown business don't pay, but you need written authorization from someone of sufficient rank, and determining sufficient rank requires understanding military hierarchy you never learned. A sergeant's authorization might be legitimate or might be a soldier trying his luck with a borrowed seal. You've learned to look for signs of authenticity, quality of parchment, clarity of the seal impression, whether the ink looks fresh or appropriately aged. You're essentially a forensic document examiner with no training, making snap judgments that could get you fired if you're wrong either direction. Wave through someone who should have paid. The bridge warden finds you. Challenge someone with legitimate authorization? You might get reported to their commanding officer, and suddenly you're explaining yourself to people who have actual power and short tempers. Historians still argue whether medieval toll collectors had any real discretion or were simply human enforcement mechanisms for rigid rules. And the answer is definitely the former, despite officials claiming the latter. The written rules are guidelines at best, suggestions interpreted through layers of precedent, custom, bribery, and fear. You quickly learn that flexibility keeps you alive and rigid rule enforcement gets you beaten. A merchant who's a penny short but clearly honest? You let it slide. A wealthy trader who's trying to undercount his cargo? You count carefully and charge the maximum. Justice is situational and survival-oriented, which probably makes you a bad person by some philosophical standard, but philosophy doesn't keep you fed or safe. The bribery situation is constant and openly discussed, which somehow doesn't make it less illegal. Merchants offer you extra coins to forget part of their cargo. Travelers suggest that their cargo is actually lighter than it appears, winking meaningfully while sliding additional pennies across your counting table. Noble household servants hint that their lord would appreciate efficiency in processing, accompanied by silver that's technically a tip but functionally a bribe. You're explicitly forbidden from accepting any of this by official policy, while simultaneously understanding that everyone assumes you're accepting it and your actual salary is calculated on the assumption that bribes will supplement your income. It's corrupt all the way down, and you're just another participant in a system that officially denies its own nature. The bridge warden, your immediate supervisor, conducts random inspections where he stands behind you for hours, watching transactions, comparing your collected tolls against traffic volume. These inspections are theoretically to prevent theft, but actually to ensure you're stealing the acceptable amount rather than excessive amounts. There's an unofficial tolerance level, maybe 10% of daily revenue, that everyone understands can disappear into collectors' pockets. Go above that and you're fired or prosecuted. Stay below that and you're underpaid and stupid. The sweet spot is 3 to 7%, enough to matter for your survival, not enough to trigger official consequences. You've never been explicitly told this, but Thomas explained it during your training with the weary tone of someone describing obvious natural laws. Your counting methods need to be both accurate and fast, which are often contradictory requirements. You've got a small brass scale for weighing suspicious coins. Clipped coins weigh less. Counterfeit coins often have different metal ratios that affect weight. But weighing every coin would create traffic jams that back up for miles, so you weigh selectively, relying on experience to identify suspicious pieces by sight and feel. Genuine silver pennies have a particular color, a specific heft, edges that feel right between your fingers. Counterfeits are usually softer, wrong color, or have casting marks that stamped coins don't show. You're developing expertise in numismatics without even realizing it, building a mental database of acceptable versus questionable currency. The mathematical requirements are more complex than they initially appear. Medieval arithmetic uses Roman numerals for record keeping, which makes addition manageable but multiplication and division genuinely difficult. You're adding combinations of pennies, halfpennies, and farthings. A penny subdivides into 2 halfpennies or 4 farthings, but people pay in mixed combinations that require constant conversion. A cart toll of 7 pennies might be paid as 3 pennies, 5 halfpennies, and 8 farthings, which equals. You do the math quickly, checking on your fingers under the table. Yes, 7 pennies exactly. Correct. Next, traveler. You maintain a daily tally on a wax tablet, scratching marks into the soft surface with a stylus, then transferring totals to vellum at day's end. The vellum record is official and permanent, stored in the bridge office for audit and taxation purposes. Your wax tablet can be smoothed and reused indefinitely, which makes it economical but also means mistakes can be erased, both accidentally and intentionally. You've developed careful habits, double-checking each tally mark, counting totals multiple times, because errors come out of your pay. Short the crown's revenue and you're penalized. Report excess revenue and you're suspected of planning to pocket it later. The target is exact accuracy achieved through methods that make exact accuracy nearly impossible. The language barriers add another layer of complexity. London attracts travelers from across Europe, French merchants, Flemish wool traders, Italian bankers, German craftsmen. Most speak some English, but technical discussions about cargo and rates often fail. You've picked up fragments of French by necessity, enough to count and discuss common goods.
Combien?
How much?
Trop cher.
Too expensive. These phrases repeat daily in multiple languages until they're burned into your memory. You've learned to communicate through gestures when language fails. Pointing at cargo, holding up fingers for quantities, shaking or nodding for yes and no. Is crude but functional, and functional is all that matters in a toll house. The seasonal variations affect both traffic volume and traveler mood, which directly impacts your daily experience. Summer brings heavy traffic, harvest shipping, trade fairs, comfortable travel weather. You're busy from dawn until dark, processing hundreds of transactions, collecting substantial revenue, exhausted but at least not bored. Winter reduces traffic to essential trips only. You're cold and lonely, watching empty bridge stretches for hours, then suddenly processing a small group before returning to solitude. Spring and fall are moderate, but spring brings flooding that sometimes closes the bridge entirely, giving you unexpected days off that are both relief and worry because no tolls collected means no wages earned. Your enforcement mechanism for non-payment is essentially non-existent. If someone refuses to pay, you can, what exactly? Physically stop them? You're one person in a wooden box. Block the bridge? There are 19 arches. Traffic can flow around you. Report them? To whom and what's the follow-up? The system relies on social compliance, the general acceptance that tolls must be paid because that's how society functions. Most people pay without argument. Some negotiate. A tiny minority simply refuse and dare you to do something about it. You write down descriptions: tall man, red beard, driving ox cart with grain. Knowing this information is essentially useless but creating the appearance of consequences. Sometimes the bridge warden takes these reports seriously and sends guards after flagrant violators. Usually nothing happens and everyone just accepts minor losses as operating costs. Remember that pregnant sheep tax Thomas mentioned? You've now encountered it personally. A shepherd brings 30 sheep across, and you charge 3 pennies for 30 animals. He mentions casually that 12 are pregnant. You pull out your rate schedule, find the supplementary livestock provisions, and discover there is indeed a surcharge for pregnant animals because they're transporting multiple creatures. The surcharge is 1 farthing per pregnant animal. 12 pregnant sheep equals 12 farthings equals 3 pennies additional. The shepherd stares at you like you've grown a second head. You cannot be serious, he says. You show him the schedule. He reads it, his lips moving silently, then produces 3 more pennies with the resigned expression of someone who's encountered bureaucratic absurdity before and knows resistance is futile. This job makes everyone complicit in madness, and you've officially joined that club. Your days blur into a rhythm of sameness punctuated by occasional absurdity. Count coins, argue politely, record transactions, repeat. The rules you're enforcing make decreasing sense the longer you enforce them, but sense isn't required, only obedience and the appearance of order. You're a cog in a revenue machine, grinding out pennies for lords you'll never meet, implementing rules written by clerks who've never collected a single toll personally. It's soul-deadening work made worse by knowing it's also essential work, that bridges need funding and maintenance, that your meaningless job serves meaningful purposes you'll never directly witness. The sun sets and you count the day's collection for the 3rd time, ensuring accuracy. The total matches your tally. You record it carefully on vellum, lock the chest, and settle onto your bench knowing tomorrow will be exactly the same but somehow also unpredictably different. That's the contradiction you inhabit now, endless repetition containing infinite variation. A job that's both completely routine and constantly surprising. The river rushes below. The toll schedule sits beside you, its incomprehensible rules your gospel. You're a priest of commerce, and your prayers are counted in pennies. The bridge isn't just a transportation corridor. It's a commercial district, a residential neighborhood, and a public spectacle all compressed into 900 feet of stone and timber. Your toll house sits in the middle of this chaotic ecosystem, surrounded by neighbors who range from mildly unpleasant to actively dangerous. The shops built directly onto the bridge are technically illegal according to various royal proclamations issued over the decades, but enforcement is sporadic and corruption is universal, so the structures persist and multiply like architectural barnacles. These shops extend out over the river on wooden platforms supported by diagonal bracing, creating a second level of precarious construction that makes your cantilevered toll house look positively stable by comparison. Immediately to your left, maybe 15 feet away, is a fishmonger's stall that operates from dawn until mid-afternoon when everything is sold or too spoiled to sell. The smell is apocalyptic, a combination of fish guts, river mud, and decomposition that intensifies exponentially in summer heat. The fishmonger, a gap-toothed man named Edmund who's missing his left ear from some incident he refuses to discuss, guts his catch directly onto the bridge surface, sweeping the offal into the river below. This attracts birds, gulls, crows, ravens, that circle constantly, screaming and fighting over scraps. The noise is relentless, a chorus of avian rage that penetrates your toll house walls and becomes the soundtrack to every transaction you conduct. Travelers sometimes step in fish guts while approaching your window, then track bloody footprints across the bridge, leaving marks that don't fully wash away until the next heavy rain. To your right is a baker who operates from a building that's technically a house but functions as a commercial bakery on the ground floor. The family lives above, and you can hear their domestic arguments through your shared wall. The wife accusing the husband of drinking profits, the children crying, the husband defending himself with increasing volume until someone throws something breakable and the argument pauses temporarily. The bakery smell is pleasant, at least fresh bread, especially in early morning when the first batches emerge. You've developed a Pavlovian response where warm bread smell makes you simultaneously hungry and depressed because you can rarely afford the baker's prices on your salary. He charges bridge prices, which means inflated costs justified by location and captive customer base. A loaf that costs a penny in the city proper costs 2 pennies here, and your requests for neighbor discounts have been politely but firmly declined. Beyond the baker, maybe 50 feet further, is a barber surgeon who advertises his services with a pole painted in spiral red and white stripes, representing blood and bandages respectively. This is where people come for haircuts, tooth extractions, bloodletting, and minor surgeries performed with instruments that are cleaned infrequently and sterilization concepts that won't be discovered for another 5 centuries. You've watched him work on slow days, pulling teeth with pliers while the patient screams, lancing boils with casual efficiency, applying leeches to patients who believe bad blood causes all illness. Medieval medicine is equal parts folklore, religious belief, and accidental effectiveness, and the barber surgeon practices all three with equal confidence. His waste also goes into the river. Bloody rags, extracted teeth, medical refuse that floats downstream toward communities who get their drinking water from this same river. Nobody seems concerned about this arrangement. The beggars are constant and strategic in their positioning. They cluster near your toll house because this is where traffic slows, where people are already reaching for money, where charity appeals might succeed. There's a woman missing both legs who sits on a wheeled platform, propelling herself with her hands, calling out blessings to anyone who drops coins in her bowl. There's a blind man, or claiming to be blind, you've caught him tracking movement too accurately to be fully sightless, who recites prayers in exchange for pennies. There's a child, maybe 8 years old, with a withered arm who tugs at travelers' cloaks and perfects a pitiful expression that's remarkably effective at extracting sympathy money. The bridge warden periodically clears them away, but they return within hours because this location is too profitable to abandon. You've developed complicated feelings about them. Sympathy for their genuine suffering mixed with resentment that they complicate your already difficult job. The pickpockets work the crowd with professional efficiency, often coordinating with the beggars in arrangements that are probably organized crime but operate too smoothly to prove. A traveler stops to give charity to the child, attention momentarily diverted, and a young man bumps into them from behind, apologizing profusely while his hands work through their purse. By the time the traveler realizes coins are missing, the thief is 50 feet away in the crowd, and pursuit is impossible in the dense bridge traffic. You've watched this happen dozens of times and said nothing because interfering makes you a target, and you're already vulnerable enough in your wooden box. The unofficial rule is that you protect the tolls and ignore everything else. The bridge has its own ecosystem of crime and survival, and you're just another organism trying to persist. Then there are the merchants operating without permits, selling goods from temporary stalls, or even just blankets spread on the ground. They appear during busy periods, set up quickly, conduct transactions, and vanish before authorities arrive. These ghost merchants sell everything: questionable meat pies, healing amulets, love potions, knives that might be stolen, cloth that's probably smuggled to avoid import duties. The quality ranges from genuine to fraudulent, and buyers have no recourse because these merchants have no permanent location or legal status. You've seen travelers bite into meat pies that immediately cause violent illness, purchased from vendors who disappeared minutes earlier. The free market has minimal regulation here, and caveat emptor isn't just a phrase, it's a survival requirement. Prostitutes work the bridge during evening hours, positioned strategically near the taverns that occupy several bridge buildings. The taverns themselves are legitimate businesses, paying rent and operating with proper licenses, but they attract clientele that includes sailors, soldiers, and traveling merchants, men far from home with money to spend and minimal supervision. The prostitutes negotiate openly, leading clients to rooms rented by the hour in buildings that officially don't permit such activities but profit from them anyway. You hear transactions being negotiated outside your window, prices discussed, services specified, destinations confirmed. It's background noise you've learned to ignore, though occasionally you wonder about the economics involved. They're performing labor in exchange for money just like you, except their work is significantly more dangerous and marginally more profitable, which says something depressing about both professions. Historians still argue whether medieval bridges functioned as genuine communities or merely commercial zones, and having lived here you can confirm they're both simultaneously. People form relationships despite the transient nature of bridge life. The fishmonger and the baker hate each other over some decade-old dispute nobody remembers clearly, but they both trade with the barber surgeon and share information about city politics. The beggars have territories and hierarchies, sorting themselves by earning potential and seniority. Even the prostitutes have recognized beats and informal agreements about client distribution. It's a society compressed into stone and timber, complete with social structures, conflicts, alliances, and the daily dramas that emerge whenever humans occupy the same space repeatedly. The Bridge Chapel, dedicated to St. Thomas Becket, because medieval England was obsessed with Thomas Becket after his dramatic martyrdom, sits at the southern end, technically outside your immediate neighborhood, but close enough that you hear the bells marking daily hours. The chapel is one of the bridge's few concessions to something beyond commerce and survival. It's small, maybe 30 feet long and 20 wide, with space for perhaps 50 people uncomfortably packed. Services occur daily at dawn and dusk, attended by the bridge's permanent residents and occasional travelers seeking blessings before crossing or giving thanks after arriving safely. You've been exactly once, during your first week, thinking it might provide community or comfort. The priest delivered a sermon about the spiritual dangers of avarice while staring directly at you, the toll collector, as if your job was personal sin rather than appointed duty. You haven't returned. The chapel does provide one useful service, sanctuary. The legal concept that churches offer protection from arrest operates here too, theoretically. Criminals who reach the chapel can claim sanctuary for up to 40 days, during which authorities can't legally seize them. You've seen desperate people sprint for the chapel doors with guards pursuing, the difference between capture and temporary freedom measured in seconds and steps. Sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't. The unsuccessful attempts end with violence that's quick and brutal and conducted with the casual efficiency of routine enforcement. Bodies are removed, blood is washed away with river water, and traffic resumes as if nothing happened. The bridge has seen too much death to treat any individual death as particularly notable. The private residences built onto the bridge create their own complications. These are multi-story structures, often 4 or 5 floors tall, occupied by merchants wealthy enough to afford bridgefront property. Living on the bridge means no morning commute, direct access to commercial traffic, and prestige of address. London Bridge is famous enough that shopkeeper on London Bridge carries weight in social situations. But it also means noise, smell, danger from fire and flood, and living in a structure that sways slightly during heavy wind or traffic. You've watched these buildings during storms, seen them flex and creak, timber frame construction absorbing stress through movement rather than rigid resistance. It's architecturally sound but psychologically disturbing, especially when you're inside one of these buildings and feeling it respond to weather and traffic. The heads on pikes are your most disturbing neighbors, though calling them neighbors feels wrong since they're decorative corpses rather than living residents. The southern gatehouse displays the heads of executed traitors on iron spikes, a practice called heading that's meant to warn potential criminals about consequences while simultaneously rot and be consumed by birds in full public view. Currently, there are 12 heads in various stages of decomposition, ranging from relatively fresh, executed last week, still recognizably human, to ancient, maybe 6 months old, reduced to skull and dried tissue. The crows and ravens feast daily, landing on the spikes and tearing at whatever edible material remains. You can see these heads from your toll house if you look south, and you've stopped looking south because some sights, once seen, don't fully leave your memory. One of the beggars, the woman on the wheeled platform, once told you the heads have names, that she's been here long enough to know their stories. That one was a counterfeiter, she said, pointing with a scarred hand. That one plotted against the king, or they said he did, same difference really. That one I don't know. But he's been up there 5 months, so he must have done something impressive. She spoke casually, the way you'd discuss weather or market prices, because death is common enough here that it doesn't warrant special tone. You gave her a penny, partially for the information and partially to make her stop talking. The traffic jams are daily occurrences that transform the bridge into a compressed nightmare of humans, animals, and carts pressed together in sweating, smelling proximity. The bridge is only 12 feet wide at most points, adequate for normal traffic but totally insufficient during peak hours. When a cart breaks down mid-bridge or livestock refuse to move, or two carts meet coming from opposite directions and neither driver will back up, everything stops. Travelers are trapped, pressed together, growing increasingly angry while you sit in your toll house listening to arguments escalate and sometimes evolve into fistfights. These jams can last hours, and you're expected to continue collecting tolls from people approaching from your direction while ignoring the chaos behind them. It's absurd and impossible, but you do your best because what else is there? The bridge also hosts public punishments occasionally, mostly minor offenses where the criminal is placed in stocks positioned near the chapel for maximum visibility. These aren't executions, just humiliation combined with physical discomfort and exposure to whatever the public decides to throw. Rotten vegetables are traditional, but you've seen people throw rocks, dead animals, human waste, and once an entire bucket of fish guts courtesy of Edmund the fishmonger, who apparently had a personal grievance with the criminal. The person in the stocks has no defense, no recourse, just hours of abuse followed by release and hopefully a lesson learned. You try not to watch, but the stocks are visible from your window and screams carry effectively in the bridge's acoustic environment. At night, after legitimate commerce closes, the bridge transforms into something darker. The taverns remain open, now serving the serious drinkers who'll consume until dawn or unconsciousness, whichever comes first. Fights spill onto the bridge surface regularly. Drunken arguments over nothing that escalate to violence because alcohol impairs judgment and medieval conflict resolution tends toward physical solutions. The night watch patrols periodically, breaking up fights and removing the unconscious, but they can't be everywhere and don't particularly try. You hear breaking glass, shouted threats, sometimes the particular sound of fist hitting face or body hitting stone. You keep your door barred and your knife close and pray nobody decides the toll house would be entertaining to attack. You've learned the difference between normal night sounds and genuinely dangerous situations. Normal: drunken singing, argumentative voices, footsteps, dog barking. Dangerous: running footsteps, multiple voices shouting coordinated commands, metal scraping against stone, swords being drawn, or worst of all, sudden silence after noise, which usually means something very bad just happened and everyone is processing it. When you hear dangerous sounds, you extinguish your candle, sit silently in darkness, and wait for whatever crisis to resolve itself without your involvement. Heroism is not part of your job description, and survival requires knowing when to ignore things beyond your responsibility. Your relationship with these neighbors is professionally distant and emotionally complicated. You need them, they're witnesses if something happens, potential help in emergencies, the closest thing to community you have. But they also complicate your work, compete for travelers' money, and sometimes directly interfere with toll collection through their own activities. Edmund the fishmonger occasionally, accidentally, spills fish guts near your window, making it unpleasant for travelers to approach, which seems retaliatory though he claims it's innocent. The baker's children sometimes throw pebbles at your shutters when bored. Annoying but not worth complaining about because what would that accomplish? The beggars occasionally block access to your window, forcing travelers to navigate around them, which slows traffic and reduces your efficiency. You coexist in tense mutual tolerance, everyone pursuing their own survival in this compressed ecosystem. The bridge is too crowded, too chaotic, too alive with humanity in all its desperate variety. You're surrounded by people constantly yet profoundly alone in your wooden box, watching society pass by without fully participating in it. Your neighbors are close enough to hear their breathing, but too distant to call friends. It's a special kind of isolation, being lonely in a crowd, being surrounded by community while belonging to none of it, being a permanent resident of a place that's fundamentally temporary for everyone else. The fish smell intensifies as Edmund begins his afternoon cleanup. The baker's wife starts another argument. A beggar calls out blessings that sound more like curses. The heads on pikes continue their silent watch. And you sit in your toll house, counting coins and trying not to think about how this is your life now, how these are your neighbors, how this bridge is your entire world compressed into stone and commerce and the endless passage of strangers who pay and move on while you remain stationary, collecting and collecting and collecting until the river below seems like an increasingly reasonable alternative. The sanitation situation on your bridge toll house is less a situation and more a slowly unfolding biological catastrophe that you're expected to inhabit. Medieval hygiene operates on principles that future generations will find incomprehensible, but you're living it right now, and the immediate reality is that your body produces waste that needs to go somewhere, and somewhere has extremely limited options when you're locked in an 8x10 wooden box for 18 hours daily. Your toilet is a wooden bucket. That's it. That's the entire system. A simple oak bucket, maybe 10 inches in diameter and 12 inches deep, with a rope handle that's worn smooth from being carried. It sits in the corner furthest from your sleeping bench, which is a whopping 6 feet away. Not exactly luxurious separation between where you sleep and where you defecate, but it's what you've got. The bucket has no lid because lids cost extra money and apparently aren't considered essential for a toll collector's comfort. This means smell is constant and uncontainable, a permanent olfactory presence that mingles with the existing fish stench from Edmund's stall and creates an aromatic combination that could probably be weaponized if anyone were creative enough. The emptying process is humiliating and logistically complex. Officially, you're supposed to empty your bucket twice daily, morning and evening, by carrying it down the bridge to designated waste collection points where night soilmen gather refuse for disposal outside city limits. Unofficially, this is impossible because leaving your toll house during operating hours means abandoning your post, which is grounds for immediate dismissal. So you improvise. During slow traffic periods, you grab the bucket, sprint down the bridge to the nearest waste point, dump it, and sprint back, hoping no travelers arrive during your absence. The entire operation takes maybe 3 minutes if you're fast, but those 3 minutes feel like hours because you're simultaneously worried about missing tolls and mortified that dozens of people are watching you run past carrying a bucket of your own waste. The alternative, which you've adopted during busy periods, is worse. You wait until dark, after official toll collection ends, then empty the bucket directly into the Thames through gaps in the bridge structure. This is absolutely prohibited by city ordinance, explicitly forbidden by your employment contract, and practiced by literally every bridge worker because the official system is completely unworkable. You lower the bucket on a rope through a gap in the bridge's defensive wall, dump it into the river below, rinse it with river water, the same river you just contaminated, in a feedback loop of escalating filth, and haul it back up. The rope is permanently stained and smells like exactly what it's been used for, and you try not to think about the fact that this same rope sometimes brushes against your hands during normal activities. Bathing is theoretical rather than practical. There's no bathhouse on the bridge, no room for such luxury, and traveling to city bathhouses requires time you don't have and money you can't spare. The medieval understanding is that bathing is vaguely dangerous anyway, that water opens skin pores and allows disease to enter the body, so infrequent washing is actually protective rather than neglectful. You're not entirely convinced by this logic, but it's convenient justification for reality. You manage a kind of standing wash once weekly if you're disciplined about it, using a basin of river water heated over a small brazier, soap made from animal fat and lye that burns slightly when applied, and cloth rags for scrubbing. The process removes the top layer of grime but never quite reaches actual cleanliness. You're perpetually slightly dirty, existing in a state between recently washed and objectively filthy, that becomes your new normal. Your clothing situation compounds the hygiene problems. You own 2 complete outfits, what you're wearing and 1 spare, because more would be unaffordable and unnecessary since you're not attending social events or trying to impress anyone. The base layer is a linen undertunic that absorbs sweat and body oils, supposedly protecting your outerwear garments from contamination. This works theoretically, but in practice the linen becomes progressively more disgusting, yellowed with sweat and spotted with mysterious stains that resist washing. You're supposed to wash it weekly, which requires heating water, scrubbing with harsh soap, rinsing and drying, a half-day process that you postpone repeatedly because spending your rare free time doing laundry feels like admitting defeat. The wool outer tunic never gets washed because wool is expensive, water damages it, and medieval wisdom holds that airing wool periodically is sufficient maintenance. You hang it outside your toll house window on sunny days, letting ultraviolet light and fresh air do their mysterious purification work. Does this actually clean anything? Probably not significantly, but it makes you feel like you're trying, which counts for something psychologically if nothing else. The wool absorbs smells, fish from Edmund's stall, smoke from your candles, your own body odor, the general miasma of bridge life, until your clothing becomes a walking archive of olfactory memories. You smell like yourself, yes, but also like every environment you've inhabited, every meal you've eaten near open fires, every unventilated space you've occupied. Your hair is another frontier in the war against filth. Medieval hair care consists primarily of combing and hoping for the best. You own a wooden comb that you run through your hair daily, removing loose hair, bits of debris, and probably a substantial population of lice, though you try not to examine the comb too carefully because some knowledge brings only despair. Washing hair requires significant water, soap, and drying time, so it happens maybe monthly if you're virtuous and quarterly if you're realistic. Between washings, your hair becomes progressively greasier. That natural oil production that's supposed to protect hair instead making it clump and stick together in formations that defy styling. You've adopted the practical solution of keeping it shortish, shoulder length or above, because longer hair becomes unmanageable quickly and you lack both time and vanity to maintain it. Lice are inevitable. Everyone has them. The question isn't whether you have lice, but how many and how aggressively they're breeding. You've accepted this reality with the resignation that comes from recognizing insurmountable problems. The eggs, nits, attach to hair shafts near the scalp where it's warm, and combing removes some but never all. The adult lice move quickly when exposed, making them difficult to catch and kill. Medieval delousing is a social activity, people picking through each other's hair, crushing parasites between thumbnails with satisfying little pops. You have nobody to delouse you, so you're self-sufficient, contorting to examine sections of your own scalp, developing impressive flexibility in pursuit of parasite management. The itching is constant background noise, like the river sound, something you learn to ignore until it becomes severe enough to demand attention. Fleas are the other omnipresent parasite, though they're less specific to humans and therefore somehow more democratic in their distribution. They live in fabrics, straw bedding, wooden furniture cracks. Basically everywhere in your toll house provides ideal flea habitat. You wake with new bites regularly, small red welts that itch intensely and occasionally become infected if you scratch them open. Medieval flea management consists of laying aromatic herbs in bedding, lavender, pennyroyal, fleabane, which supposedly repels them through scent. You've tried this. The fleas seem unimpressed. The herbs make your bedding smell nicer, which is a small victory, but the biting continues unabated. You've developed a philosophical acceptance. Fleas are part of life, like taxes or rain, and resistance is futile. Rats are your least favorite cohabitants, though calling them cohabitants implies a voluntary arrangement rather than the invasion it actually is. The bridge's wooden structures, abundant food waste, and proximity to water create ideal rat habitat. They nest in the gaps between bridge supports, in the spaces behind wall panels, under floorboards, anywhere dark and protected. You hear them constantly, scratching, squeaking, scurrying across surfaces with the distinctive sound of tiny clawed feet on wood. At night, they become bolder, emerging into your toll house to investigate any available food. You've learned to store everything edible in a suspended basket, hanging from a ceiling beam by a rope that rats theoretically can't climb. They're working on it, though. You've watched rats attempting the rope climb, failing, trying again with the persistent determination that's either admirable or horrifying depending on your perspective. The rats carry disease, probably. Medieval medical understanding attributes illness to bad air, miasma, rather than microbial transmission, so rats are considered nuisance animals rather than active health threats. Future centuries will connect rats to plague epidemics, but right now they're just annoying creatures that eat your food, contaminate your space, and occasionally bite if cornered. You've killed dozens with a club you keep specifically for rat management, smashing them when they become too bold or numerous. The bodies go into the river, naturally, adding to the Thames's impressive collection of dissolved organic matter. The river itself is your garbage disposal, your toilet, your washing water source, and somehow also where people downstream draw drinking water. The cognitive dissonance is profound if you think about it too directly, so mostly you don't. Everything goes in the river: human waste, animal waste, fish guts, industrial runoff from tanneries and slaughterhouses upstream, dead animals, refuse of every description. The water is brown, opaque, and probably more texture than liquid at this point. You've stopped looking closely because ignorance is genuinely protective here. When you need water for washing, you draw it from the river and heat it, which supposedly purifies it through fire's cleansing properties. Does boiling actually kill harmful organisms? Yes, though nobody knows why yet. You're accidentally practicing effective hygiene through theological reasoning, which works out fine even if the logic is backwards. Drinking water is theoretically safer. You purchase it from water carriers who claim to source from upstream springs and wells rather than directly from the Thames. Whether this is true is unknowable, and the water still tastes slightly of minerals and mystery, but it hasn't killed you yet, so you continue buying it. The alternative is ale, which is genuinely safer because the brewing process involves boiling water, and the alcohol provides additional antimicrobial properties. You drink small ale, low alcohol content, consumed throughout the day, staying in a state of perpetual mild intoxication that's considered normal and healthy. Being completely sober is actually unusual in medieval daily life, and the slight buzz helps make toll collection more tolerable. Food storage and consumption present their own hygiene challenges. You have no refrigeration, no preservation methods beyond salting and drying, and limited storage space. Your diet consists primarily of bread, cheese, dried fish, and occasional vegetables when you can afford them. The bread develops mold if kept too long, which you cut away and eat the rest because wasting food is economically impossible. The cheese also molds, but cheese mold is considered the acceptable kind. You're basically eating protopenicillin and don't even know it. The dried fish is eternally salty and tough, requiring extended chewing to make edible, and probably contains more parasite eggs than actual fish tissue by weight. You eat it anyway because protein is protein. Historians still argue whether medieval people were aware of their own uncleanliness or simply had different standards, and the answer is probably both. You notice smell only when it changes. Your own body odor is invisible to you through constant exposure, but Edmund's fish stall remains aggressively noticeable. You're probably equally offensive to fresh arrivals, producing a distinctive toll collector aroma that combines unwashed human, damp wool, candle smoke, and confined space mustiness. Travelers sometimes wrinkle their noses approaching your window, and you've stopped taking it personally because what could you do differently? This is the smell of your profession, your life circumstances, your economic class. Wealthy people smell better because they can afford frequent washing, fresh clothing, perfumes, and aromatics. You smell like work and survival, which is honest at least. Your teeth are degrading slowly, inevitably, despite your best efforts. You clean them by rubbing with cloth dipped in salt water, which provides mild abrasive action and supposedly strengthens gums. Does this actually help? Marginally, maybe. Your diet is heavy on bread, which wears teeth down mechanically, and low on refined sugar because sugar is expensive luxury, which accidentally protects you from the worst decay. Still, you've got increasing sensitivity in your molars, a persistent ache in one canine that might be a cavity forming, and the general sense that your teeth are assets steadily depreciating toward eventual catastrophic failure. The barber surgeon can pull teeth but can't fix them, so dental problems have only one solution: extraction, which is painful, dangerous, and leaves you with gaps that make eating progressively more difficult. You've seen elderly people, meaning 40+ years old, with mouths that are more gap than tooth, gumming their food like infants. That's your future if you live long enough. Wounds and injuries become infected easily in this environment. You've got numerous small cuts and scrapes from normal activities, splinters from wooden surfaces, scrapes from rough stone, nicks from your counting knife. Each one is an infection risk, and infection can escalate from minor inconvenience to life-threatening sepsis with alarming speed. You've learned to clean injuries with wine when you can afford it. The alcohol provides antimicrobial properties, though again, nobody knows the mechanism. Wounds that show red streaks radiating outward are especially dangerous, indicating infection spreading through lymphatic system, which medieval medicine can't effectively treat. You pray such injuries stay minor and heal naturally, because the alternative is amputation or death, and neither sounds appealing. The mental health impact of living in constant low-level filth is harder to quantify but definitely present. You feel perpetually slightly uncomfortable in your own skin, always aware of itching, smelling, the various small physical irritations that come from inadequate hygiene. This creates psychological weight, a baseline dissatisfaction that colors every experience. You can't fully relax because something always itches or smells or needs attention. It's exhausting in ways that aren't dramatic but are persistently draining, like trying to sleep with a pebble in your shoe. Not agonizing, but never quite comfortable. Your toll house has become a biologically complex ecosystem unto itself, hosting human resident, you, mammalian parasites, rats, insect parasites, lice, fleas, bacterial colonies, everywhere, in quantities that would horrify future microbiologists, and fungal growth, mildew on every surface that stays damp. You're the dominant organism by size, but by population, the microbes vastly outnumber you, and in many ways they're controlling the environment as much as you are. Medieval people are vaguely aware of corruption and putrefaction as illness sources but don't understand microbial reality. You're living in active collaboration with billions of organisms you can't see and wouldn't understand if you could. The bucket sits in the corner, needing emptying again. Your hair itches. Something is biting your ankle, flea probably. The smell of fish guts wafts through your window on the afternoon breeze. Your clothing feels damp and clingy from humidity and sweat. This is normal. This is Tuesday. This is life in a medieval bridge toll house, where cleanliness is aspirational rather than achievable, where hygiene is theoretical rather than practical, where you exist in dynamic equilibrium with filth because the alternative, staying clean, requires resources and infrastructure you simply don't possess. You scratch your head, crush a louse between your thumbnails, and return to counting coins. The river flows below, carrying away today's waste and delivering tomorrow's problems. Everything is temporary except the smell. The irony of your position is exquisite and inescapable. You handle more money in a single day than most peasants see in a year. Your fingers touch thousands of silver coins weekly. You're literally surrounded by wealth flowing through your toll house like the river below, and you're still poor. Not struggling but managing poor, not temporarily embarrassed millionaire poor, but genuinely, persistently, structurally poor in ways that make mockery of your daily immersion in currency. You're a money-handling poverty case, and the contradiction would be funny if it weren't your actual life. Your official salary is 48 pennies per month, paid by the Bridge administration in quarterly installments of 144 pennies. This sounds reasonable until you start calculating actual purchasing power and cost of living. A loaf of decent bread costs 1 penny. A small ale costs a halfpenny. A basic meal, bread, cheese, onions, runs about 2 pennies. So you're earning roughly food for 48 days per month, which technically covers basic nutrition if you eat minimally and never get sick, have emergencies, need clothing, or want anything beyond bare survival. The math is tight enough that a single unexpected expense, torn boots, broken tools, illness requiring medicine, can cascade into genuine crisis. The pay structure assumes you're supplementing through tips and gratuities, which is official terminology for bribes that everyone acknowledges without calling them bribes. Travelers occasionally give extra coins for fast service or special accommodation, allowing oversized carts through without full payment, accepting slightly short payments when someone's genuinely a few pennies light, expediting their passage during traffic jams. These extras might add another 20 to 30 pennies monthly if you're charming and opportunistic. But charm requires energy you're often lacking, and opportunism requires moral flexibility that depletes your soul incrementally. You take the extra coins when offered and try not to think too hard about what you're becoming. The actual poverty manifests in countless small ways. Your boots are resold twice because new boots cost 20 pennies, nearly half your monthly salary, and even resoling costs 3 pennies you resent spending. The soles are leather layered with wood, and the wood wears through to reveal holes that let in water, cold, and the general filth of bridge surfaces. Your feet are perpetually damp and developing what might be fungal infection, itchy patches between toes that you can't effectively treat because antifungal medication won't be invented for centuries. You stuff your boots with straw for insulation, which helps slightly and adds a distinctive crunchy sound to your walking. Your food budget is approximately 30 pennies monthly, which means you eat a lot of bread, the cheap, dense, dark bread made from rye and barley rather than expensive wheat. This bread has the texture of compressed sawdust and the flavor of disappointment, but it's filling and stores reasonably well if you keep it away from rats. You supplement with hard cheese that's more salt than dairy, onions when they're cheap, dried fish when you can afford it. Meat is occasional luxury, maybe once weekly if finances allow. A meat pie from a street vendor, or stew from the tavern when you're feeling extravagant. Fresh vegetables are too expensive and spoil too quickly, so you get minimal nutrition beyond bread-based calories. Your diet is probably deficient in multiple vitamins that won't be scientifically identified for centuries, and you're developing the vague malaise that comes from sustained nutritional inadequacy. The money-counting process itself is simultaneously tedious and anxiety-inducing because errors come directly from your pay. You're expected to achieve perfect accuracy while working in poor light, during all weather, with a constant stream of impatient travelers rushing your transactions. The Bridge administration audits your collections weekly, comparing your reported totals against expected traffic volumes and merchant records. Discrepancies are assumed to be theft unless you can prove error, and proof requires documentation you rarely have time to maintain properly. You've been docked pay 3 times already this year, 2 pennies here, 5 pennies there, for unexplained shortfalls that were probably honest mistakes but might have been successful fraud by travelers who shorted you coins while you were distracted. The coin verification process requires skills you're developing through expensive trial and error. Counterfeit coins are common enough that checking authenticity is mandatory, but distinguishing genuine from fake requires experience you're acquiring by occasionally being fooled. Counterfeiters produce surprisingly good imitations, coins that look right, feel almost right, and pass casual inspection. The tells are subtle: wrong weight, wrong sound when dropped on stone, wrong color under close examination, slightly incorrect dimensions. You've got your brass scale for weighing suspicious pieces, but using it for every transaction would create traffic jams that get you disciplined. So you weigh selectively, relying on developing intuition about which coins warrant scrutiny. Clipped coins are another constant problem. People illegally shave metal from coin edges, collecting these shavings to sell to metalworkers while passing the diminished coins at full value. A severely clipped coin might be 10 to 15% lighter than it should be, representing real value loss. You're supposed to reject clipped coins, but travelers often argue they received them honestly and shouldn't suffer for others' crimes. This is technically true and puts you in impossible positions. Reject the coin and the traveler can't pay the toll. Accept it and you're passing bad currency, creating a loss that someone eventually has to absorb. That someone is often you, when auditors catch the clipped coins in your daily deposits and dock your pay accordingly. The foreign coins complicate everything further. London attracts continental merchants bringing French deniers, Flemish groats, Italian florins, and coins from jurisdictions you can't even identify. Each has different silver content, different official exchange rates, and different street-level values that deviate from official rates based on actual metal content. You're expected to know these rates, calculate conversions mentally, and make instant decisions about acceptable equivalences. The official rate table is written on vellum you're supposed to memorize, but it's 3 pages of dense text listing dozens of currencies with their relative values. You've memorized the common ones. French deniers trade at roughly even with English pennies. Flemish groats are worth about 4 pennies, but obscure currencies require consulting the table while travelers wait impatiently. Money handling has made you intimately familiar with every coin's physical characteristics. English pennies have the king's face on one side, currently Edward III, looking noble and probably nothing like the actual Edward III, and a cross on the reverse. The cross extends to the coin's edge, creating convenient breaking points because pennies can be physically broken into halfpennies or farthings when smaller denominations are needed. You've broken hundreds of pennies, learning the technique. Place on a hard surface, position knife blade along one of the cross arms, strike firmly with a stone or mallet. The coin splits relatively cleanly if you're skilled, creating half pennies that are legally acceptable currency. Your counting table has a permanent dent from this process, a shallow groove worn into the wood from countless coin-breaking impacts. The heaviest coins you handle are groats, worth 4 pennies each, which are thick, substantial pieces that feel important when held. Wealthy merchants pay in groats to minimize counting, handing you fewer coins representing more value. This should simplify transactions, but instead creates new problems because making change for a groat requires having multiple pennies available, and your change supply is limited. When someone pays a 3-penny toll with a groat, you need to return 1 penny, which comes from your personal float, the small quantity of coins you maintain for making change. Depleting your float means you can't make change for the next traveler who overpays, creating cascading problems that require careful cash management throughout the day. The locked chest is simultaneously security measure and psychological torture device. Every coin you collect goes immediately through the slot, dropping into the chest's interior where it joins the growing pile of the day's receipts. You hear them land, the clink of metal on metal, gradually shifting to the heavier sound of coin hitting pile of coins. By day's end, there might be 500 pennies in that chest, representing substantial wealth that you can't access. The chest has 3 locks requiring 3 different keys held by 3 different officials, making unauthorized opening theoretically impossible. This protects the crown's revenue, but also means if you're genuinely short on change, or need emergency funds, or face any situation requiring access to money that's technically in your possession, you're helpless. You're a custodian of wealth you don't control, a guard protecting treasure from yourself. Historians still argue whether toll collectors' salaries were intentionally kept low to encourage supplemental income through corruption, or whether the low pay simply reflected the position's low social status, and honestly, both explanations seem accurate simultaneously. The system assumes you'll skim a little, maybe 3 to 5%, while remaining honest enough to avoid large-scale theft that would threaten revenue. It's structured corruption, built into the compensation model, acknowledged silently by everyone while officially denied. You've adopted a personal rule: never more than 5 pennies daily from what passes through your hands. 5 pennies is roughly 10% of your daily salary, meaningful enough to matter but small enough to hide in the natural variation of traffic and counting. You don't think of it as theft. It's more like correcting an unjust salary structure through self-directed compensation adjustment. The taking itself requires careful technique because audits compare your reported collections against merchant records and traffic observations. You can't simply pocket large coins, which would create obvious discrepancies. Instead, you skim halfpennies and farthings, the small denominations that are easy to miscount, that travelers often themselves lose track of, that create plausible deniability. A merchant pays 7 pennies for his cart toll using a mix of pennies, halfpennies, and farthings. You count it carefully, announce the total, he nods and moves on, and you've palmed a halfpenny during the counting process. Not every transaction, that would be too risky, but maybe 1 in 10, selecting opportunities where you're confident and the traveler is distracted or rushing. Your conscience about this has evolved through several stages. Initially, horror and guilt, feeling like a criminal violating sacred trust. Then, rationalization, telling yourself the salary is unjust and this merely corrects systemic unfairness. Currently, numb acceptance, skimming mechanically without emotional engagement because thinking about it too directly makes functioning impossible. You've become what the system expected you to become, which is either tragic or inevitable or both. The philosopher in you, whatever remains of that person, recognizes this as structural corruption, the way unjust systems create unjust behaviors in decent people trying to survive. The pragmatist in you, who's currently dominant, just takes the coins and adds them to your small personal stash, hidden in a gap behind your toll house's wall planking. Your hidden savings amount to roughly 40 pennies, about a month's salary, accumulated slowly over 6 months of careful skimming. This cash represents security, emergency funds, the difference between destitution and temporary survival if you lose your position. You check it periodically, touching the coins to confirm they're still there, that rats haven't somehow accessed them, that reality matches your memory. These 40 pennies might be the most important possession you have. More valuable than your boots, your clothing, your tools combined. They represent freedom, options, the ability to survive unemployment for a month while seeking other work. They're also evidence of criminal activity that could result in prosecution if discovered, making their hiding spot a source of constant low-level anxiety. The poverty mindset has colonized your thinking patterns in ways you barely notice anymore. Every purchase requires extensive mental calculation. Not just, can I afford this, but what do I sacrifice to afford this? New boots mean reduced food for 2 weeks. A tavern meal means no candles next week, working in dimness and risking counting errors. A visit to the barber surgeon for that tooth pain means depleting emergency funds and accepting increased vulnerability. Everything trades against everything else in zero-sum mathematics where there's never enough to cover all needs simultaneously. You've mastered the art of delayed gratification, postponing purchases until circumstances force action, waiting until boots develop holes before replacing them, wearing clothing until it's literally falling apart, eating minimal food until hunger becomes unignorable. The wealthy travelers you serve daily mock your poverty through their mere existence. A noble paying a 2-penny horse toll might hand you a silver coin worth 12 pennies, wait impatiently while you calculate change, then tell you to keep the excess as if 10 pennies is trivial gratuity rather than your food budget for 5 days. The gesture is simultaneously generous and insulting, generous in absolute terms, insulting in the casual dismissal of value that's meaningful to you but negligible to him. You accept with appropriate gratitude because refusing would be bizarre, but internally you're calculating what those 10 pennies represent. 20 meals, 5 candles, boot repairs plus 2 loaves of bread, or added to your hidden savings, bringing you closer to genuine security. The money flows through your hands like the river below, constant, substantial, and ultimately leaving you untouched by its abundance. You're the channel, not the destination. You process wealth without accumulating it, handle prosperity without experiencing it, facilitate commerce without benefiting from it beyond bare subsistence. It's like standing in the rain while dying of thirst, surrounded by water you can't drink. The metaphor is apt enough that you've stopped thinking about it because metaphors don't change reality, and reality is depressing enough without poetic elaboration. The coins clink in the chest below your feet. You've just collected 8 pennies from a wool merchant, 7 of which went through the slot and 1 of which is now hidden in your palm, pressed against your thigh where nobody can see. Tomorrow you'll add it to your hidden stash. Tomorrow you'll be slightly less poor, slightly more secure, slightly further from the edge of total destitution that's always visible in your peripheral vision. Tomorrow you'll handle another 1,000 pennies that aren't yours, will never be yours, that merely pass through your hands en route to the crown's treasury. You're wealthy and impoverished simultaneously, rich and broke, drowning in currency while starving for money. The contradiction has stopped seeming strange. This is just how it works when you're a toll collector, keeper of treasure you'll never possess, guardian of wealth that guards nothing for you. The bridge has tried to kill people before, not metaphorically, not through slow attrition, but through sudden catastrophic events that turn stone and timber into death traps. Your toll house sits on this structure, cantilevered over water that's both escape route and drowning pool, attached to a bridge that's survived multiple disasters but could always experience one more. The history is written in repairs, replacement sections, memorial plaques in the chapel for workers who died during construction, and the stories old-timers tell about that time when. Floods are your most regular existential threat, occurring with predictable seasonality that doesn't make them less dangerous. The Thames rises during heavy rains and spring snowmelt, and when it rises significantly, the bridge's 19 arches create a bottleneck effect. Water flowing downstream encounters these stone obstacles, backs up, increases in depth and pressure, then accelerates through the arches with tremendous force. The narrowed channels create rapids that can reach 6 to 8 feet of elevation difference between upstream and downstream sides, essentially waterfalls underneath each arch. These rapids make shooting the bridge in a boat genuinely dangerous, a challenge that kills several watermen yearly when they misjudge currents or their vessel capsizes in the turbulence. During major floods, the water level rises high enough to threaten the bridge's lower structures. Your toll house sits roughly 15 feet above normal water level, which feels safe until you learn that the 1324 flood, just 16 years ago by medieval reckoning, brought water to within 6 feet of the bridge deck. If water reaches the deck, it starts flowing over the roadway, which creates entirely new problems. Traffic becomes impossible, wooden structures start floating or tearing loose. The bridge becomes temporarily useless while simultaneously being the only fixed crossing point for miles. You've been here 6 months and haven't experienced a major flood yet, but you've heard stories. Edmund the fishmonger remembers 1324, describes water, rising like the devil himself was pushing from below. Shops flooding, people trapped in upper floors, one of the chapel's bells ringing continuously as floodwater somehow activated its mechanism. He says 3 people drowned when a bridge building collapsed into the current. Their bodies recovered miles downstream days later, bloated and unrecognizable. The bridge's pilings make it structurally vulnerable in ways you're gradually understanding. Each arch rests on massive stone foundations called starlings, protective structures built around wooden pilings driven deep into the riverbed. These starlings are boat-shaped to deflect current and ice, wider than the arches they support, creating the narrowed channels that make water flow faster. The starlings are engineering solutions that create new problems. They catch debris floating downstream, accumulating logs, barrels, dead animals, vegetation, and miscellaneous refuse that builds into dams. These debris dams restrict water flow further, increasing upstream flooding while simultaneously creating pressure on the starlings themselves. Clearing debris is dangerous work done by men in small boats who use poles and hooks to dislodge accumulated material during low tide. You've watched this process. Men working inches from rapids that could capsize their boats instantly, pulling at massive logs wedged between starlings, occasionally losing their grip and nearly following the debris downstream. Ice jams are winter's contribution to bridge-based terror. When the Thames freezes, which happens irregularly but memorably, ice forms in sheets and chunks that flow downstream until they encounter the bridge. The starlings catch ice just like they catch debris, and ice is far more destructive. Large ice chunks impact with tremendous force, grinding against stone, potentially damaging the starlings' protective surfaces. When enough ice accumulates, it can form complete blockages that stop water flow entirely, creating temporary dams that raise water levels upstream dramatically. Then, when the ice dam breaks, as it eventually must, the released water surges downstream in a wave that's part flood, part avalanche, carrying ice chunks the size of carts that can destroy anything in their path. The 1331 ice jam supposedly broke with such force that several fishing boats moored near the bridge were crushed instantly, reduced to splinters and sailcloth, their crews jumping to shore barely in time. Fire is the nightmare that keeps you awake during dry summers. Your toll house is wooden. The shops adjacent to you are wooden. Many of the bridge's buildings are partially wooden, even though the bridge itself is stone. Medieval cities burn with horrifying regularity. London had major fires in 1212, 1220, and 1227, and bridges are particularly vulnerable because they're densely built with limited escape routes. The 1212 fire on London Bridge killed thousands. Accounts vary between hundreds and 3,000, when fire broke out simultaneously on both ends of the bridge, trapping people in the middle. Some jumped into the river and drowned. Some burned. Some were crushed in the panic. The exact death toll is unknowable because medieval record-keeping wasn't comprehensive, and many victims were unidentified poor people whose deaths weren't officially noted. What's certain is that a substantial portion of the bridge burned and many people died, and the bridge was subsequently rebuilt with more stone and theoretically better fire prevention. Your fire escape plan is simple and probably inadequate. Grab the locked chest, which you physically cannot do because it's bolted to the floor, and run toward the nearest end of the bridge. In practice, this means abandoning the chest, grabbing whatever personal possessions you can carry in approximately 10 seconds, and running toward either north or south depending on which direction fire is coming from. If fire is coming from both directions, which happened in 1212, you jump into the Thames and hope you survive the fall, the impact, and the current. The fall is approximately 20 feet from your toll house to the water surface, survivable but likely to cause injury, especially if you land badly. The impact could knock you unconscious, in which case you drown. The current could carry you into the rapids under the arches, where you're battered against stone until you drown or suffer fatal injuries. Your survival odds in this scenario are perhaps 30%, and that's being optimistic. But 30% is better than 0%, which is what you get by staying in a burning building. The structural maintenance situation inspires neither confidence nor panic, settling somewhere in the uncomfortable middle of probably adequate but definitely not optimal. The bridge is inspected annually by the bridge master, a position of significant authority responsible for maintenance, repairs, and overall structural integrity. These inspections identify problems that are then scheduled for repair based on severity and available funds. Available funds is the operational phrase here, because bridge maintenance competes with other civic priorities, city walls, public buildings, the king's various construction projects, and usually loses. Repairs happen eventually, but eventually might mean months or years depending on whether the problem is immediately dangerous or merely progressively dangerous. You've noticed your toll house's supporting beams have some concerning features upon close inspection. There's a crack in one beam, running about 6 inches along its length, that you watch nervously during heavy traffic. Wood cracks naturally as it ages and dries, and not all cracks indicate structural failure, but distinguishing normal aging from dangerous damage requires expertise you don't possess. You reported it to the bridge warden, who examined it briefly, said keeping an eye on that, and took no further action. This could mean it's not serious or could mean repairs aren't prioritized. You're unsure which interpretation is correct and probably won't know until either the crack stabilizes or your toll house falls into the river. The defensive considerations add another layer of vulnerability. The bridge is a fortified structure with gates at both ends, defensive positions during conflicts or civil unrest. These gates can be closed to control access, turning the bridge into a checkpoint where passage requires permission. This makes strategic sense but creates obvious problems. If the gates close while you're on the bridge, you're trapped between them, potentially for days if the conflict is serious. Your toll house becomes a cell in a siege scenario, and your food and water supplies, currently minimal, would last maybe 3 days before starvation becomes genuine concern. You've never asked what the protocol is for bridge workers during gate closures because you suspect the answer is, figure it out yourself. And that knowledge wouldn't help anyway. Historians still argue whether medieval bridges were over-engineered or under-maintained, and the answer is probably both sequentially. Initially over-engineered during construction, then progressively under-maintained as decades pass and budgets shrink. London Bridge was built to last centuries, using massive stone blocks and advanced engineering techniques for its era. But 60 years of traffic, weather, and inadequate maintenance have accumulated where that makes the structure less robust than its designers intended. It's still strong, still safe under normal conditions, but normal conditions aren't the problem. The disasters happen during abnormal conditions, extreme floods, severe ice, major fires, exactly when you need the structure to be strongest. The bridge's age shows in countless small ways. Stones have cracked from freeze-thaw cycles. Water seeps into tiny cracks, freezes, expands, and slowly splits the stone. Mortar has eroded from joints, especially near water level where constant exposure weakens the bond. Some of the starlings show impact damage from centuries of debris and ice, their upstream faces scarred and pockmarked. None of these are individually catastrophic, but collectively they represent degradation, the slow entropy that affects all human structures. The bridge is dying slowly, imperceptibly, at rates measured in decades rather than days. It will outlive you, probably, but it won't last forever, and you're living on it during its gradual decline. The traffic load itself stresses the structure in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Every cart that crosses, laden with wool, grain, stone, timber, whatever cargo London's commerce requires, exerts force on the bridge deck, transmitted through to the arches and foundations. Medieval engineers understood load distribution intuitively even without modern structural analysis, building arches that channel weight downward into foundations. But they couldn't fully account for cumulative loading over decades, the gradual compression and microsettling that occurs under sustained weight. The bridge is slowly sinking into its foundations, millimeters per year, a rate so slow that no single generation notices, but that compound over centuries into measurable change. Your toll house participates in this slow settling, though at different rates than the main bridge because it's cantilevered and moves semi-independently. You've noticed the door doesn't hang quite square anymore. There's a gap at the top corner that wasn't there initially, which lets in rain and cold air. This could mean the frame is settling, or the bridge deck is deflecting slightly, or your toll house is very slowly rotating on its mounting brackets. None of these explanations are comforting. You stuff rags in the gap and try not to calculate how long before the misalignment becomes severe enough to matter structurally. The wind load during storms is something medieval engineers definitely understood because wind is dramatically obvious when you're on an exposed bridge over water. The toll house acts like a sail, catching wind and transmitting that force to its mounting brackets. During strong storms, you feel the structure flex and sway, the walls creaking, wind whistling through gaps in planking. The movement is small, maybe an inch of deflection at the top of your walls, but perceptible and terrifying when you're inside experiencing it. The brackets hold. They've always held. But there's a first time for every failure, and you're constantly aware that you might be present during that first time. The combination of water below, weather above, age throughout, and traffic constantly makes the bridge a fascinating study in dynamic stresses and accumulated risks. Engineering students centuries from now will analyze medieval bridge design, calculating load factors and safety margins, probably concluding that these structures were remarkably resilient given their builders' limited theoretical knowledge. But you're not an engineering student doing safe retrospective analysis. You're living on the structure, trusting your life to decisions made by people who died decades ago, maintained by a system that's chronically underfunded and dealing with disasters when they occur rather than preventing them proactively. You've developed a kind of fatalistic acceptance about disaster risk. Worrying constantly would be psychologically unsustainable, so you've calibrated your anxiety to appropriate concern rather than constant terror. You notice structural issues without obsessing over them. You have escape plans without rehearsing them compulsively. You accept that the bridge might flood, burn, or collapse, while simultaneously trusting it probably won't today. This is the same psychological adaptation everyone living in the bridge structures makes. Selective attention and strategic denial in service of functional daily life. The river flows below, patient and persistent, slowly eroding the starling stones, freezing and thawing in its seasonal cycles, occasionally flooding with destructive force. The bridge resists, stone and mortar and timber and human maintenance working together to withstand the river's patient assault. You live in the middle of this contest, hoping the bridge wins, knowing that eventually, maybe centuries from now, maybe tomorrow, the river will claim victory. Everything human-made is temporary. Some things are just more temporary than others. A cart rumbles past, heavy with stone. Your toll house sways slightly, the brackets groaning. Normal, probably. You've gotten good at distinguishing normal sounds from concerning sounds, normal movement from dangerous movement. The crack in the support beam hasn't grown noticeably. The door gap hasn't widened significantly. The river hasn't risen lately. Everything is fine, which means everything is temporarily not disastrous, which is the best you can hope for when living in a wooden box bolted to a 60-year-old bridge over a river that's trying to destroy that bridge through patient geological persistence. You collect another toll, drop the coins through the slot, and listen to them clink against the growing pile. The sound is reassuring, normal, routine, the opposite of disaster. Today is not the day the bridge burns, floods, or collapses. Today you survive. Tomorrow you'll face tomorrow's risks with tomorrow's worry. The structure groans in the wind, just settling, probably. The social hierarchy of medieval London places you somewhere between actual human being and necessary nuisance, occupying a status tier that's above criminals and beggars, but well below anyone respectable society acknowledges in daylight. Toll collectors exist in a peculiar social limbo, essential for civic function, universally resented for that function, and regarded with the kind of ambient suspicion normally reserved for con artists and politicians. You're the human embodiment of taxation, and people hate taxes with a purity of emotion they rarely achieve toward abstract concepts. By extension, they hate you personally, despite never having met you before and knowing nothing about you except that you're extracting their money. The job carries a reputation that preceded you and will outlast you. Toll collectors are assumed to be corrupt. Not potentially corrupt, not sometimes corrupt, but definitively and universally corrupt as a defining professional characteristic. This assumption isn't entirely unfair, given that you are in fact skimming coins regularly, but it's still insulting to be prejudged based on occupation rather than individual character. Travelers approach your window already defensive, already calculating how to minimize payment or avoid it entirely, already assuming you're trying to cheat them. The distrust is mutual and self-reinforcing. They assume you're dishonest, so they attempt dishonesty, which confirms your belief that they're trying to cheat you, which justifies the dishonesty they assumed you'd practice. It's a perfect cycle of reciprocal bad faith that makes every transaction slightly adversarial. Your uniform, the simple tunic bearing the bridge's insignia, a small embroidered symbol on the chest that identifies your official status, marks you as belonging to the administrative class without actually granting you any respect that class normally receives. You're recognizable as an official, which means people moderate their behavior slightly in your presence, but you're not respected as an official, which means that moderation extends only to avoiding openly illegal behavior, not to treating you courteously. The cognitive dissonance is constant. Travelers acknowledge your authority by paying tolls while simultaneously dismissing your personhood by treating you as a mechanical obstacle rather than a human being. The loneliness is profound and multifaceted. You're surrounded by people constantly. Hundreds pass through your toll house daily, but meaningful human connection is essentially non-existent. Transactions are brief and transactional, rarely extending beyond the minimum necessary exchange. 3 pennies. Here. Thank you. Next. You've learned to read emotional states quickly. Angry, rushed, resigned, cheerful, but reading isn't connection. You know these people as types rather than individuals, and they know you not at all. You're the toll collector, a role rather than a person, and roles don't have feelings, needs, or interior lives worth acknowledging. Your isolation from normal social structures is nearly complete. You work when other people work, meaning no social opportunities during business hours. You work where you live, meaning no separation between professional and personal space. Your job is universally disliked, meaning people avoid befriending you because association might be professionally or socially disadvantageous for them. The other bridge workers, Edmund the fishmonger, the baker's family, even the beggars, interact with you minimally, maintaining the kind of distant cordiality that acknowledges shared space without implying actual relationship. You're neighbors in proximity but strangers in every meaningful sense. Romantic prospects are essentially zero. Marriage in medieval society is primarily an economic arrangement, and you're a poor man in a low-status occupation with no property, no prospects for advancement, and a workplace that's a wooden box on a bridge. What exactly would you offer a potential spouse? Join me in my 8x10 toll house, where we can be poor together while society resents us? The sales pitch writes itself, and it's terrible. You've noticed women your age, passing through, conducting business, living on the bridge, and occasionally made eye contact that suggested mutual awareness of each other as humans rather than background scenery. But awareness doesn't translate to opportunity when your entire life is structured to prevent normal social interaction. The few conversations you have outside of toll collection are with other social outcasts, creating a kind of bottom-tier network of the dismissed and forgotten. The beggars talk to you because you're physically present and they're desperately bored. Edmund occasionally shares fish trade gossip because you're a captive audience who can't leave. The barber surgeon stops by your toll house sometimes to discuss medical theories you don't understand but nod along with because human conversation is rare enough to be valuable regardless of content. These interactions are better than nothing, but they're not friendship, not really. They're proximity-based social simulation, people talking near each other because actual connection is unavailable. Historians still argue whether medieval society was more or less hierarchical than later periods, and from your position the hierarchy feels extremely rigid and completely determinative of life experience. Your social status is fixed by your occupation, and your occupation is fixed by economic necessity, and economic necessity is determined by birth circumstances you didn't choose and can't change. Social mobility exists theoretically: apprenticeships, merchant success stories, rare marriages across class lines, but practically you're locked into the tier you started in. Being a toll collector means you'll always be regarded as a toll collector, even if you eventually leave the job. The stain of low-status work is permanent, or at least permanent enough that redemption within a single lifetime is unlikely. The contempt is expressed in countless small ways. Travelers who pay tolls drop coins on your counting table rather than handing them to you, avoiding physical contact as if your poverty might be contagious. Merchants discuss their business affairs while you're clearly within earshot, confident that your opinion doesn't matter and your discretion is automatic because who would you tell? Nobility on horseback doesn't acknowledge your existence beyond the minimum required to conduct the toll transaction, treating you as furniture that happens to speak. Children from merchant families point at you and ask their parents questions. Why does that man live in a box? And the parents hush them while steering them away, as if your circumstances are either shameful secret or inappropriate conversation topic. You've internalized some of this contempt, which is perhaps the worst part. You catch yourself thinking of your position as shameful, your life as failure, your daily existence as something to escape rather than experience. This self-loathing is corrosive, eating away at whatever self-respect you arrived with, replacing it with resignation and bitterness. You're becoming the person society expects you to be: resentful, slightly dishonest, emotionally withdrawn, counting days until something changes while knowing nothing will change. The job isn't just isolating your present. It's colonizing your future, making it progressively harder to imagine being anything other than what you currently are. The mental health implications of sustained isolation and social contempt aren't well understood in medieval times. People recognize that hermits sometimes go mad, that solitary confinement is punishing, but the mechanisms aren't analyzed or treated. You're experiencing what future psychologists might call depression, though you lack vocabulary for it beyond feeling low or melancholy. The symptoms are familiar even if the framework isn't. Difficulty finding pleasure in anything, persistent low mood, negative thoughts about yourself and your future, fatigue that sleep doesn't fully resolve, loss of appetite beyond what poverty alone explains. You're not suicidal exactly, but you're also not particularly invested in survival beyond animal instinct. If something happened, if you got sick, if the bridge flooded, if any of various disasters occurred, you're not sure you'd fight very hard to survive. This isn't active death wish. It's more like profound ambivalence about existence. The substance use situation is complicated but probably contributing to your psychological decline. You drink small ale throughout the day because it's safer than water and socially normal, maintaining a baseline blood alcohol level that's mild but constant. This probably isn't helping your mood. Alcohol is a depressant after all. But stopping isn't realistic when ale is your primary beverage and clean water is suspect. You've experimented with stronger drink during particularly difficult periods, purchasing actual ale or wine from the tavern, drinking until the edges of reality soften and your problems seem temporarily manageable. This helps short-term and worsens everything long-term, the classic addiction trap, though you're not yet drinking enough to call it addiction. You're just drinking enough to call it concerning. The comparison to actual criminals is instructive because they often seem happier than you despite objectively worse circumstances. The pickpockets work in teams, joke with each other, have camaraderie born from shared illegal enterprise. The prostitutes form protective networks, looking out for each other, creating community in the margins of society that's rejected them. Even the beggars have their hierarchy and relationships, their shared understanding of survival strategies and mutual support when authorities crack down. You have none of this. You're isolated by the structure of your job, which requires individual work in a fixed location, preventing the kind of mobility and networking that creates community even among outcasts. Your dreams about the future have contracted to almost nothing. You no longer imagine escaping to better employment because better employment requires references, skills, or connections you don't possess. You no longer imagine marriage and family because who would marry you and how would you support them? You no longer imagine adventure or travel because you can't save enough money and can't abandon your job without starving. Your aspirations have reduced to continue surviving, with maybe occasional additions like repair boots or eat meat this week. This poverty of ambition is perhaps more depressing than poverty of money. You've lost not just resources but also hope, imagination, the capacity to envision alternatives to present circumstances. The bridge's permanent residents form something like community, but it's community based on geographic proximity rather than genuine affinity. You all live here because circumstances left you no better options, not because you chose this life or each other. The relationships are cordial because making enemies in close quarters is dangerous, but cordiality isn't warmth. Nobody celebrates your successes because you have no successes to celebrate. Nobody mourns your losses because your losses are too common and minor to warrant attention. Everyone's boots are worn, everyone's food is inadequate, everyone's sleeping on hard surfaces. So why would your specific version of these universal problems merit special acknowledgement? The comparison to your pre-toll collector life is painful when you allow yourself to remember. You had friends once, before you took this job, people from your home village, fellow workers in whatever trade you practiced before desperation led here. Those relationships have withered from neglect and distance. You haven't seen these people in months, can't afford to travel home, wouldn't know what to say if you did. Yes, I'm living in a box on a bridge collecting money from people who hate me. How are you? The shame is too acute to voluntarily expose yourself to comparison with people who might have found better paths. It's easier to let those relationships die through attrition than to maintain them while feeling fundamentally inferior. The few people who treat you with consistent kindness stand out so dramatically that you remember each instance. A merchant who learned your name and uses it during transactions, transforming you from role to person for 30 seconds. A traveler who paid his toll and then gave you an extra penny for a hot meal, acknowledging your humanity through the simple recognition that you eat and might enjoy eating well. The baker's daughter who sometimes smiles at you genuinely rather than the professional smile she uses for customers. A smile that says, "I see you as human," rather than, "I see you as transaction facilitator." These tiny moments of recognition sustain you more than they should, becoming outsized in importance because they're so rare. The social death you're experiencing is gradual and incomplete. You're not fully erased, not invisible, but you're marginal enough that your presence or absence wouldn't significantly impact anyone's life. This might be worse than complete isolation because you're constantly reminded of community you can observe but not join, relationships you can witness but not participate in, social warmth you can see but not feel. You're the ghost at the feast, present but not really there, watching life happen around you while you collect coins and count days and slowly disappear into the role that's consumed your identity. The river flows below, and somewhere downstream are people who drink water contaminated by your waste, who navigate currents you've watched but never experienced, who live lives completely disconnected from yours despite sharing the same river, the same city, the same historical moment. You're connected by proximity and infrastructure while remaining fundamentally separate, which describes not just your relationship to downstream communities but your relationship to everyone. Connected but separate, visible but unseen, present but absent, alive but not really living. The toll collection continues. Another traveler, another transaction, another small interaction that affirms your role while denying your personhood. You collect 3 pennies, drop them through the slot, watch the next person approach. The cycle is endless, and so is your isolation. Tomorrow will be the same. You've stopped hoping otherwise. The question haunts you during quiet moments. Why would anyone voluntarily choose this job? And the answer, uncomfortable but honest, is that voluntarily and choose are doing heavy lifting in that sentence. Nobody wakes up as a child dreaming of becoming a toll collector. No parent tells their offspring, study hard, so you can one day sit in a wooden box collecting pennies from people who resent your existence. This isn't a career, it's a consequence, the result of circumstances, poor luck, limited options, and the various disasters that reduce human potential to survival-level employment. Your own path here is depressingly typical. You were the third son in a family of modest means, not wealthy enough to provide inheritance for multiple children, not poor enough to qualify for charity. Your older brothers inherited the family's small landholding and trade connections, leaving you with supportive wishes and essentially nothing material. Apprenticeship might have been an option if your family could afford the fees, but quality apprenticeships cost money and require connections your family didn't possess. You worked as a day laborer for several years, agricultural work during harvest, construction when available, anything that paid enough to eat. The work was inconsistent, the pay was terrible, and you were always one illness or injury away from complete destitution. Then you accumulated debt. Nothing dramatic, just the steady accumulation of small shortfalls during periods of unemployment. A penny borrowed here for food, 2 pennies there for shelter, 5 pennies from a merchant who charged interest that compounded faster than you could repay. Within a year you owed 20 pennies to various creditors, which doesn't sound like much until you're earning maybe 40 pennies annually and spending 35 on basic survival. The math doesn't work. The debt grows. The creditors become insistent, then threatening. And then someone, maybe the merchant you owed, maybe a friend of a friend, mentions the toll collector position. Steady employment, fixed salary, prestigious government work. It sounded better than debtor's prison or fleeing the city to escape creditors, so you took it. This pattern, debt leading to desperate employment, is common enough to be structural rather than individual failure. The medieval economy runs partially on credit because actual currency is scarce, and credit relationships trap people in dependency that can be converted into labor when debts come due. Your position was probably arranged by your primary creditor, who had connections to bridge administration, who exchanged debt forgiveness for your labor commitment. You agreed to take the job because the alternative was legal consequences, which could range from asset seizure, you had no assets, to imprisonment, debtor's prison being a place where you're punished for being poor by being made poorer, to physical punishment. Viewed this way, your choice was between toll collector and worse outcomes, making choice a technical term for coercion with extra steps. Some toll collectors arrive through family obligation, their fathers or uncles held the position before them, and family pressure or explicit inheritance arrangements transfer the job like property. This seems insane, inheriting a terrible job as if it were a privilege, but it makes economic sense in a world where any employment is better than none. The position comes with salary, housing, terrible housing, but housing, and the security of knowing you'll eat regularly even if you'll never prosper. For families at the economic margins, having one member in guaranteed employment can mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for everyone. So the toll collector position becomes a family asset, passed down through generations, accumulating decades of institutional knowledge about skimming without getting caught and tolerating social contempt without going insane. Minor crimes are another pathway to toll collection. If you've done something illegal but not serious enough to warrant execution or mutilation, petty theft, brawling, minor fraud, authorities sometimes offer positions like toll collector as alternative punishment. You work for reduced wages, the difference going toward restitution or fines, effectively experiencing indentured servitude disguised as employment. This arrangement benefits everyone except you. The victim gets compensated, the authorities avoid prison costs, and you get to keep your hands and head attached to your body. The job becomes penance, each day's collection a payment towards social debt, and you're reminded constantly that you're here as punishment rather than opportunity. Historians still argue whether medieval labor markets were primarily free or coerced, and the answer varies dramatically by status and circumstance. Skilled craftsmen in guilds exercised considerable control over their labor and conditions. Landless peasants and urban poor, which describes the majority, had freedom that was theoretical rather than practical. You're free to refuse the toll collector position the same way you're free to starve, free to be imprisoned for debt, free to leave the city and try your luck elsewhere with no resources or connections. These freedoms are technically real and practically meaningless. The success stories, rare enough to be notable, reveal just how low the bar for success actually is. Thomas, your predecessor who trained you, is technically a success. He survived 12 years in the position, saved enough money to rent a small room in the city, and retired while still possessing basic physical and mental function. This is the aspirational outcome. Not prosperity, not even comfort, just survival followed by slightly different survival in a slightly less terrible location. Another toll collector from years ago supposedly accumulated enough savings to open a small shop selling candles, though rumors also suggest he achieved this through aggressive theft rather than prudent saving. The ambiguity doesn't matter. What matters is that he escaped, and escape of any kind is remarkable enough to become legend. The psychological profile of successful long-term toll collectors reveals certain common traits: emotional detachment bordering on dissociation, ability to tolerate social contempt without internalizing it completely, comfortable relationship with minor corruption, and either complete absence of ambition or ability to suppress it entirely. You're developing some of these traits already, the detachment especially, the way you can process transactions mechanically without engaging emotionally with travelers as humans. This is adaptive for the job, but probably maladaptive for life generally. You're training yourself to not feel things, and that training doesn't stop when you leave the toll house. You're becoming someone who doesn't feel much of anything because feeling is painful and pain is best avoided. The people who fail at toll collection, and failure is common, generally fail through one of several patterns. Some crack psychologically, developing the kind of obvious mental distress that makes continued employment impossible. They start talking to themselves, or crying during transactions, or shouting at travelers, or refusing to collect tolls because the entire system seems unjust, which it is, but recognizing injustice doesn't pay rent. These people are removed and replaced, disappearing into the city's population of struggling unfortunates. Their brief toll collector tenure just another chapter in stories of downward mobility. Others fail through excessive corruption, skimming too much, getting caught, facing prosecution. The bridge administration tolerates minor theft because they understand the salary is inadequate, but there's a line, and crossing it has consequences. You've heard of toll collectors imprisoned, fined amounts they couldn't possibly pay, or sentenced to physical punishment that left them unable to work. The irony is that the people who steal most aggressively are often the ones most desperate, least able to afford the consequences, creating a feedback loop where desperation leads to risk-taking that leads to punishment that increases desperation. Some simply leave, abandoning the position without notice or explanation. They're there one day and gone the next, the toll house empty, travelers confused, bridge administration scrambling to find replacements. These sudden departures suggest crisis. Maybe they found better employment. Maybe they fled creditors. Maybe they just couldn't tolerate another day and walked away into uncertain alternatives. You understand the impulse. You've considered it yourself during particularly difficult stretches, imagining just not showing up tomorrow, letting someone else deal with the coins and the contempt and the wooden box over the river. The fact that you haven't left says something about your options, and what it says isn't encouraging. The recruitment process for replacements reveals how bottom-tier this position actually is. When a toll collector position opens, it's filled quickly because there's always someone desperate enough to take it. The bridge administration doesn't need to offer competitive wages or attractive conditions. because they're not competing for qualified candidates. They're selecting from a pool of people who have essentially no alternatives. The interview, if it can be called that, consists of verifying you can count coins, add numbers, and tolerate being yelled at without crying. These qualifications are surprisingly rare among the desperately poor, but they're not exactly impressive credentials. Your own resignation to the position has evolved over 6 months from horror to acceptance to something like dark peace. You've stopped imagining dramatic escapes and started focusing on modest improvements, saving enough for better boots, maybe accumulating funds to visit home eventually, perhaps one day renting a room off the bridge and commuting to work like a regular person. These tiny ambitions are simultaneously pathetic and sensible. They're achievable, unlike fantasies about prosperity or social mobility, making them functional goals rather than delusional wishes. You're learning to want less, and there's liberation in reduced expectations even as it represents spiritual defeat. The rare individuals who enter toll collection through choice rather than desperation are fascinating psychological cases. Some are ideologically committed to civic service, believing that facilitating commerce and collecting revenue for bridge maintenance is genuinely important work worth doing. These people are either saints or deeply confused, possibly both, and they tend not to last long because ideology doesn't protect against the daily grind of contempt and isolation. Others are hiding from something: criminal pasts, family obligations, social embarrassments, and the toll house offers anonymity through obscurity. You're noticed constantly but never really seen, making it excellent cover for people who need to disappear without leaving. The generational toll collectors, people whose families have held the position for decades, have developed elaborate coping mechanisms and institutional knowledge that borders on craft expertise. They know exactly how much to skim without triggering audits, which travelers are likely to shortchange you versus pay honestly, what times of day are busiest and which are slowest, how to read weather and predict traffic patterns. This knowledge is transmitted verbally, father to son, uncle to nephew, in whispered conversations that constitute an oral tradition of survival-level corruption. You're not part of this lineage, having arrived through debt rather than inheritance, so you're learning these lessons through painful trial and error rather than inherited wisdom. The job's few genuine advantages are worth acknowledging, if only for psychological balance. You're employed steadily, which is more security than many people have. You're housed, even if that housing is terrible. You're developing skills, arithmetic, negotiation, reading people that might transfer to other work eventually. You're observing commerce and society from a unique vantage point, learning things about human behavior and economic patterns that might be valuable someday. These advantages are real, even if they're vastly outweighed by disadvantages, and recognizing them helps maintain the minimum psychological equilibrium necessary for continued function. The ultimate answer to why anyone takes this job is the same answer to why anyone does any terrible job. Because the alternatives are worse, because survival requires compromise, because perfect choices aren't available to imperfect people in unjust systems. You're a toll collector because circumstances and decisions, mostly not your own, led here, and because leaving requires resources and options you don't currently possess. It's not noble or aspirational or even particularly interesting. It's just economics and necessity dressed up in the language of employment. Another day ends. You've collected tolls, counted coins, tolerated contempt, survived. Tomorrow you'll do it again because tomorrow you'll still need to eat, still need shelter, still be trapped by the same circumstances that trapped you today. This is your life now, not because you chose it in any meaningful sense, but because choice requires freedom, and freedom requires resources, and resources require luck or inheritance or opportunities that weren't available to people like you. The river flows below, carrying away today's waste and bringing tomorrow's problems. The toll house creaks in evening wind. Your hidden savings have grown by 2 more pennies today. You're up to 42 now, each one representing a small victory in the war against complete destitution. It's not much. It's not nearly enough. But it's more than nothing, And more than nothing is the best you can achieve in a job that exists because someone has to do it, and that someone might as well be you because nobody better wants it. The stars appear above London, invisible through smoke and clouds. The bridge settles into night rhythms, and you remain stationary, collecting and surviving and existing in the small space between disaster and escape, waiting for circumstances to change while knowing they probably won't. Let's slow down now. Let the bridge fade gently into evening mist. Your days in that cramped toll house blur together like watercolors in rain, each one distinct if you look closely, but blending into a continuous stream of moments and coins and river sounds. The Thames flows beneath, patient and eternal, caring nothing for human struggles conducted in wooden boxes above its surface. You've survived, which is its own quiet achievement in a medieval world where survival is never guaranteed. The toll schedule becomes softer in memory, its Byzantine complexity fading to simple truth. Everything costs something, and someone always pays. Breathe deeply now. The bridge is still there, somewhere in history, its stones worn smooth by centuries of feet and weather. The toll house is long gone, wood doesn't last like stone does. But for a moment, for these hours together, you inhabited that space completely. You felt the cold, smelled the fish, heard the river's endless commentary. You were the toll collector, and you understand now why that job existed and why it was terrible and why someone did it anyway. These are the small stories that history forgets, the daily struggles of ordinary people doing necessary work in impossible conditions. Their names unrecorded, their efforts unmarked, their humanity reduced to economic function. But you existed. In our imagination tonight, you collected those tolls, survived those winters, counted those endless coins. And in existing, even fictionally, you mattered. Every life matters, even toll collectors, even people history doesn't remember. The river knew you were there. The bridge felt your footsteps. The coins passed through your hands and carried, however briefly, your warmth. Sleep now. Let the bridge sounds fade. The creaking wood, the rushing water, the distant city bells marking hours you no longer need to count. You've earned rest, earned peace, earned the gentle darkness that forgives all struggles and asks nothing in return. Tomorrow exists, but tomorrow can wait. Tonight, you're free from the toll house, free from the river, free from the endless transactions that define days you've now completed. The Thames flows on, patient and eternal. And you can rest.